Flight from Sanctuary, Mage Saga Book 6, written and narrated by J.J. Green. Chapter 1. And finally the time came when our mountain home, which had been our sanctuary for generations, was no longer safe, and we had to flee, taking with us only our most precious items. Some of us brought paper books, though such things were already old and fragile by then, and others took cherished family heirlooms, like jewellery, paintings, and handcrafted ornaments. A few wanted to bring animals they'd grown to love, but the great mage ruled this out, with no exceptions. The colony ships did not accommodate any living organisms other than humans. Therefore, those among us who loved their pets and working beasts created clones of them and froze the embryos, then added them to the stock of wild and domesticated animal species. We also collected seeds and spores of plants, particularly trees, for wood is essential to our way of life. Most important of all, we brought our lore and the history of our kind, written within these pages and held within the minds of the 3 spirit mages. Nala paused and frowned, looking up from her screen. "Go on," said Fern, sticking his head out of a closet where he was checking all his things still remained. "I want to hear the bit about the fight at the spaceport when they finally left Earth. That has to be coming soon." He and the rest of the children had decided to return to the suite on the Bathsheba they'd occupied before going into stasis. Carina hadn't lived here, but it looked as though the Regians hadn't touched the place. Even so, now the battle with the aliens to reclaim the colony ship had been won, and no other threats loomed. A few missing personal items would have been a small price to pay. Oriana and Darius lay on a double bed, Darius resting his head on his sister's lap as they listened. Parthenia was messaging someone as she sat at a dressing table. Carina sat on a sofa, working as she waited for Bryce to arrive. Ignoring Fern's comment, Nala said to Jace, "I thought there was only ever one spirit mage." The older man sat on a single bed, resting his back against the wall, his long legs hanging down. "I've only ever known there to be one." He smoothed the hair of his thick black beard. "Our old spirit mage, Magda, said another of her kind would appear, a child, when she entered the later stages of her life, and she was correct." He smiled at Darius. "Aside from that, she never spoke of other spirit mages. What the text says is news to me, but I'm not saying your translation is wrong. I've learned many new things from the ancient documents. I'm impressed by your work. I'd no idea you were so good." Nala blushed and lifted her interface a little in an attempt to hide her face. Carina was deeply impressed by her sister's efforts too. She had had no idea Nala had been reading and translating the mage documents in the months before entering deep sleep. The young girl was full of surprises, like the time she had discovered Mesban's ember gems secreted aboard the Zenobia. There was no doubt she was extremely smart. The level of language she was using to rewrite the old mage texts far exceeded her years. Listening to her read the words out loud, it was hard to believe she was only 9 years old. Perhaps that was what had made their dark mage brother, Castiel, want to control and torture her. Maybe he'd been as jealous of his sister's intelligence as he'd been of his other siblings' mage abilities. Jace and Nala continued to discuss mage history, with Oriana and Darius chipping in, but Carina could only listen with half an ear. Her interface was occupying her attention as she tried to uncover some information that was proving surprisingly difficult to find. Taking a break from her search, she let the screen fall into her lap. The information she wanted wasn't very important. All that really mattered was that the Bathsheba was finally free of the Regions and under the Black Dogs and her own command. Retaking the ship had been surprisingly easy. The aliens had made the mistake of leaving only a few guards behind after transferring the human prisoners to their planet. As a result, they'd lost their main military advantage, overwhelmingly huge numbers. Once the Mercs and Mezban's troops had broken through the weak Region defense and reached the ship's armories, the battle was quickly over. The soldiers were not the undernourished, untrained, and unarmed inhabitants of poor settlements on backwater planets the aliens were accustomed to preying upon. Nor were they fresh out of stasis, unsteady and disoriented. The men and women had dispatched most of the insectoid aliens efficiently, and as soon as the mages could reach their supply of elixir, they'd finished the rest off with split casts before healing the soldiers' wounds. No other Region ships were approaching. All they had to do was to set a course for Earth and continue on their way. They could work out the finer details of the voyage later. Carina wondered if the living starship who had brought them here had finally flown away. The enthrall cast should have worn off hours ago, but the last time she'd enquired, the spacefaring animal had remained hanging around the Bathsheba. She guessed the creature would leave eventually, probably to return to the Region planet, or, if she feared recapture, perhaps she would undertake the kind of long journey the aliens had used her for when they raided impoverished worlds for human hosts. Banishing time-wasting musings from her mind, Carina lifted the interface and opened the screen again. They had to get underway soon. The Regions might decide to mount another attack. The problem was, in order to plot a course, they needed to know their current position. But the vast space-time anomaly drifting within and beyond the Region system was chaotically distorting the light passing through it. The Bathsheba's scanners reported fluctuating data from the direction of the cloud. And even worse, the ship's computer didn't recognize the star systems that were not obscured. She had been trying to get around the difficulty by using information from the navigation logs. If she knew the route the Bathsheba had followed since being taken off her original course, she could extrapolate their current coordinates. But the logs were incomplete, possibly due to something the Regions had done or failed to do after they took over the ship. Bryce walked in. The general conversation paused, and he announced, "Papu's in the brig, and I took Calverley straight to sickbay after releasing him from stasis." He dropped onto the sofa next to her and added, as the discussion in the room resumed, "Poor guy's in a bad way." She would never have described Calverley as a poor guy, but she wasn't surprised he was suffering ill effects from his time in deep sleep. She had felt terrible for days after awakening from stasis, and Calverley was an old man. "Is he going to be okay?" "I don't know. The medics wouldn't tell me anything. Told me to get the hell out of their way or I'd end up in sickbay too." She smiled. Black Dog medics didn't mince their words. Bryce had probably gotten the polite version of what they would have said to a fellow soldier. But then she grew serious again. Calverley had done terrible things in his career, though he had excused his actions, saying they were necessary to create a unified, civilized society. His motivations had been deluded, but honourable in his own eyes, and he'd suffered plenty at the hands of Sable Dirksen, coming close to death from starvation. If he died soon after reviving from stasis, she might feel a twinge of pity. It had been that modicum of sympathy which had prompted her to take him from deep sleep as soon as they had secured the ship. The longer he stayed under, the greater the threat to his life, and she had a feeling they'd all been in stasis longer than the few years originally planned upon. "How's the course setting going?" "Not good." She put down the screen. "In fact, if Xiao hasn't come up with anything, I'm going to suggest we give up and just pick somewhere, anywhere, far away from that screwy cloud of nonsense that's messing with the data. Then we might get our bearings." "Makes sense to me. Though," a wrinkle formed between his brows, "do you know how much fuel we have?" No." She had been concentrating so hard on navigation, she hadn't even thought to check it. "My guess is we might be low. We're way off route, right? The Regians could have used up most of it to bring us here." "I hate to admit it, but that wouldn't surprise me. I don't think they would understand the Bathsheba's engines or how to use fuel efficiently. They usually travel through deep space inside living creatures after all." But speculating about the alien's intellectual capacity wasn't going to get her, her family, or anyone else aboard closer to Earth. She lifted the interface again. "So, we need a settled system where we can refuel." Though they had no idea where they were, signs of planets inhabited by humans would show in the data. "Uh-huh." Bryce scooted closer and peered at the screen. "You should probably talk to Xiao about it." "Yeah, you're right." But she felt the events of the last few days catching up with her. She relaxed onto the sofa and rested her head on its back. "In a minute." She held Bryce's gaze for long seconds, and he held hers. She missed being around him, and she didn't want to be separated from him ever again. "Hey." She brushed his hair away from his eyes. At the same time, Fern groaned. "I hope you two aren't going to start kissing." "Oh, grow up and leave them alone," said Oriana. A realization hit. Carina sat upright. "Earlier on, I tried to figure out how long we were in stasis, but I was looking at the Bathsheba's old chrono, which we never really understood. I just remembered Cadwallader had one installed that marked standard time." She swiped, then tapped her screen. When she read the star date that came up, she dropped it into her lap. "What's wrong?" She stared into Bryce's eyes. "We've been underway for 73 years." He whistled. "No wonder Calverley looked so bad." After considering for a moment, he went on, "But it's not that important, is it? We all survived stasis. We're just a little bit older." 73 years on a colony ship. Do you have any idea how far we must have travelled? How much farther we must be from Earth than we were before? "Well, it has to be a 73-year journey, plus the distance we still had to travel on our original course, I guess. Maybe we can cut across." She rolled her eyes. "How can you think this is no big deal?" His happy, teasing look faded, and he paused, troubled. She took his hand. The duration of their journey plus the effects of time dilation would mean his parents were already long dead. It was likely the same was true of his brothers and sisters. Such was the tragedy of long-distance space travel. Embarking on an intersector voyage usually meant saying goodbye to loved ones forever. "You're thinking about your family, right?" She had never met the people who had abandoned him while he was suffering from Ithian plague. Now she never would. He heaved a deep sigh. "It's okay. I knew when I decided to come with you, I'd probably never see them again." But the Regian's hijack of the Bathsheba had turned that probably into a definitely. She squeezed his hand tighter, and he managed a strained smile. "The way I see it, the longer our trip, the more time I get to spend hanging out with you. Also, who knows what's going to happen? When we finally reach Earth, we might regret it and decide to go back. So we'll be cooped up even longer." I like your first thought better." "So do I." Her comm announced a request from Xiao. "What's up?" she asked the pilot, hoping for good news. "Have you seen the latest scanner data? The time-shifting nebulosity is on the move, and it's heading our way." Chapter 2. Carina approached the Bathsheba's bridge on her way to discuss the approaching cloud of anomalous space-time with Xiao. It was a place she'd rarely been during her time on the ship. In the months before she'd entered deep sleep, she'd preferred to leave the day-to-day running of the vessel to Cadwallader. Passing through the entrance doors triggered memories of the Lieutenant Colonel, and a wave of grief washed over her. She'd gotten so used to the man's presence in her life, it was hard to believe she would never set eyes on him again. In her early days as a merc, Cadwallader had been an object of fear. He'd been such a hard-ass, a merciless taskmaster. One look from him was all that was required to instantly bring every soldier in the vicinity into line. But since she'd become reacquainted with the Black Dogs, she had come to understand his love for the long-dead John Speedle, and occasionally his gentleness and concern for her had broken through his adamantine facade. She wished she had gotten to know more of that side of him before he died. The requirements to maintain control over a bunch of aggressive misfits must have made his life a lonely one. "I don't think we're in any trouble just yet," said Xiao, apparently reacting to Carina's expression. "I was thinking about something else." She sat at the navigator's station. "Can you bring up a holo of what we're facing?" Xiao spoke into the interface on her seat arm. The lights dimmed, and an image appeared in the center of the bridge. There was the Region star system, 4 gas giants, and the creature's rocky planet orbiting an M-type star. The Bathsheba's computer represented the anomaly as a slowly shifting amorphous grey mass, through which the light of the Region system's star and planet shone fitfully. As she watched, she could see the movement Xiao had reported. A finger of cloud was reaching out, slow and lazy, though in fact it must have been moving extremely fast. The same sort of event probably caused the deaths of Lomang, Mezban, and several soldiers. "People died when that thing edged into our flight path," she said. "But I think it was because we're inside a moving ship. The cloud moved them forward or backward in time a little bit, and when they re-entered normal time, the ship had moved away." Xiao shrugged. "What's going to happen if the cloud hits us while the Bathsheba's stationary?" Carina persisted. "Maybe nothing at all." "Your guess is as good as mine. Is there any point in speculating? We should get out of the damn thing's way. I would have moved the Bathsheba as soon as I saw it approaching, except we aren't in immediate danger, and I didn't like to do anything absent a direct order. Who's in command now that Cadwallader and Atoy have passed? You?" Carina grimaced at the proposal. She wasn't sure she wanted to be responsible for everyone aboard. Responsibility for her family was plenty for the time being. "I hadn't thought about it. We're all still settling down after our escape. But about the anomaly, have you tried to find out our position?" Xiao grimaced in reply. "Exactly. We aren't in any sector on the Bathsheba's database. We're in uncharted space. How many more of these space-time anomalies might be out there? What happens if we crash through another one while underway, and all of us blink out of time synchronicity? What if you're wrong about what happened to Lomang and the others? If the cloud time-shifted them, why didn't it time-shift part of the creature we were flying inside? You can't argue that it only affects living creatures because the ship was alive." "I thought about that. The starship comes from the same planet as the Regions, so it must have evolved the ability to move in time too." And it understood we couldn't do that, so it decided to help us out by evading the cloud? Xiao asked skeptically. It isn't impossible. Do you have a different explanation? No, but that doesn't make yours correct. Anyway, this is all moot. Trying to slow down to avoid an encounter with another cloud wouldn't be wise. If the Bathsheba stops too fast while we're travelling, even at low speed, we'll all be messy puddles. The best thing we can do if we come across another one is to alter our trajectory to go around it, if it's possible to do it in time. But you're the only one who can fly the ship. I mean, I could try, but... Xiao placed both of her hands over the flight controls protectively. Carina lifted a corner of her lips. Very funny. My point is, unless you plan on spending the rest of your natural days and then some flying the Bathsheba, you'll have to go into stasis. And while you're out of commission, who's going to alter our flight path? Some of the mercs have flying basics under their belts, you included. But do you think I could navigate around a cloud like that without putting us all in jeopardy? You're right, said Xiao. Depending on how far away we are, you might not have time to alter course. I might find it hard myself. And we must travel at top speed. But maybe you're being too pessimistic. Who's to say we're going to meet another one of those things? Let's just deal with this one. Then we can worry about the others lying in wait. While they'd been talking, the finger sprouting the anomaly groped closer. A great puff of aberrant physical law pushing in their direction. It's going to reach us in a few hours, said Xiao. Okay, do you want to do the honors? Sure. Xiao focused on the flight controls. Any particular direction you favor? Away from here. That's nice and easy. The pilot opened her controls and studied the screen. Then suddenly she bent closer toward it, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Son of a bitch! She turned to Carina, her eyes wide and disbelieving. We're out of fuel! We've got nothing, not a gram! We're dead in space! Carina got up and strode to the pilot's station. How come? She could understand it if they were low on fuel. The Regians had flown the colony ship awfully far. But it was too much of a coincidence that the fuel had run out at exactly the moment the aliens had arrived at their system. Are you looking at the right gauge? Of course I am. Then I don't get it. Carina checked the readings herself, but the pilot was correct. Unless there was a gremlin in the Bathsheba's system, the ship's tanks were empty. I think I might, said Xiao. She brought up a different screen, displaying the short-range scanner data. Bastards, Carina murmured. The scanners were picking up a large mass of deuterium tritium. It could mean only one thing. At some point during the battle for the ship, the Regians had emptied the fuel tanks. They'd understood more about starships than she'd given them credit for. Realizing they couldn't win, the aliens had decided to strand their vanquishers. Maybe we aren't totally screwed, said Xiao. We still have the Peregrine. If the Regians didn't also dump her fuel, she could tow the Bathsheba. It'll be slow going, but it's better than nothing. If they didn't dump her fuel too. Actually, that isn't our biggest concern right now. What else is going on out there? Anything new happening on the Regian planet? Xiao switched screens again. Yeah, there is something. Wait a minute, I'll feed this through to the holo. Carina straightened up to look at the 3D image. At first, the planet's surface only appeared marked by tiny specks. Like the light from the world, the specks flickered, shifting marginally in time due to the effect of the grey cloud. Uh-oh, said Xiao. I don't like the look of them. Neither did Carina. The specks had grown larger, taking on a distinct shape, the gentle sloping dome of the living starships the Regians had enslaved. The aliens must have evacuated the Bathsheba's fuel tanks not out of pure spite, but in order to give themselves time to launch a second attack on the ship. "Shit," said Xiao. "What are we going to do?" "Check the Peregrine's tanks." "On it," the pilot replied, rising from her seat. "You can't do it from here? The techs could never marry the two systems. I'll comm you when I know." As Xiao left, Carina returned her attention to the hollow. The creatures the Regians flew had grown a little larger, but it would still take them hours to reach the Bathsheba. Enough time to evacuate everyone to the Peregrine and leave, if necessary. However, she suspected Xiao would discover the Regians weren't so dumb as to leave the humans a ship to get away in. Also, the Bathsheba was essential to her plan to reach Earth. Without the colony vessel, they would never do it. The best they could hope for if they left on the Peregrine was to discover a habitable planet where no one wanted to kill them. They had to stand their ground and fight, but there were a hell of a lot of Regians on their way, and the aliens had defeated them before through sheer force of numbers. She found herself missing Cadwallader more than ever. What would the Lieutenant Colonel have done? Chapter 3. Parthenia watched Carina suiting up, her sister's expression sad but resolute. Parthenia's feelings were the same. Just when they thought they could finally resume their voyage to Earth, yet another obstacle stood in their way, and this one seemed insurmountable. The Regians had stranded them, emptying even the Peregrine's fuel tanks, and now the aliens were about to attack. The injustice of it all made her bitter. They'd fought so hard and been through so much. Why couldn't they get just one break? One thing that would come easy to them, that they didn't have to fight tooth and nail for. She snapped her helmet locks in place and gently sucked on the tube that connected to her elixir reservoir. A small amount of the sour liquid spurted into her mouth. As she looked up again, Carina was crossing the armory, walking toward her. Carina's face was grave as she put her hand on Parthenia's shoulder. "I just want to be sure you understand. You have to protect the kids first, the same as last time, okay? I'm relying on you." "Is it going to be the same as before, though?" The previous battle with the Regians had been short and decisive. The mages hadn't need to cast split much. They'd focused on healing the soldiers burned with acid. From the demeanor of her sister and the men and women around her, no one expected things to go so smoothly this time around. "Honestly, I don't know. We don't know how many Regians are coming. But if those ships are only carrying a few hundred of them each, we're going to have a hard time. We have to prevent them from boarding, then we should be okay. But if they break through somehow, we're going to be swamped. I don't know if it's much consolation, but if that happens and we lose, the Regians might not decide to use mages as hosts." Revulsion swept over Parthenia as she recalled the time she'd spent as the aliens' captive, the dreadful cold, darkness and humidity of their planet, her desperate attempts to make elixir to save her brothers and sisters, and how she'd forced her way through suffocating soil to make her escape. "I'm not going back to that place. I swear I'd rather die." Carina looked down for a moment as if debating how to respond. When she lifted her head, her face was full of fire. "That's the wrong attitude. You have to survive, Parthenia, no matter what. You must live. You never know what might happen. I don't want you to ever give up, okay? Even if the situation seems hopeless. Promise me you won't give up." Parthenia chewed her lip. Carina grabbed her shoulders and gave her a shake. "Promise me." "Okay, I promise." "Good. I have to go now. When the battle begins, stay at the back with Darius and Nala. at a safe distance. Cast split to help us out when you can, but your priority is the youngsters. Jace won't be there to help you. He's at another airlock with Fern and Oriana. I need you to do this for me." "All right, I hear you." Carina nodded, appearing satisfied, and then returned to the group of soldiers still suiting up. Her sister had taken command, as she had in the earlier battle. She seemed the obvious candidate, given her military experience and her knowledge of what the mages could do, and no one had objected. Parthenia understood why Carina had made her responsible for the protection of the siblings. She couldn't organize the defense of the ship and safeguard their brothers and sisters. Her sister's instruction didn't feel like an imposition, as once it would have. Parthenia wasn't sure why, if Carina had changed or she had. A hand touched her arm. She turned to see Camille. "I wanted to," he said, but before he could finish, Parthenia hugged him tight, their armored chests crushed together. After a moment of surprise, he hugged her back. "I was going to come and find you after we messaged, but I had to make sure my brothers and sisters were settled in." "It's okay. I also thought we'd have plenty of time to see each other. I didn't want to crowd you. You've been through a lot." "We all have. Oh, I wish you had come to see me, or I'd gone to see you." "It can't be helped now. You weren't to know what would happen." They'd been holding each other awkwardly as they'd talked. She let go of him and looked up into his face, visible through his open visor. She wanted to kiss him. It might be her last opportunity, but she couldn't do it unless they took off their helmets, and it was too late for that. "When this is over, we shouldn't wait to meet up." "No, we shouldn't. Not this time. As soon as the battle's finished, I'll comm you." "Or I'll comm you, as soon as it's over." He gave her a long look without speaking, and she understood his unspoken meaning. They were both thinking the same thing. Their chances of seeing each other again were slim. A lump swelled in her throat. Life was so unfair. Why couldn't they have had more time together? Her chin trembled and his face blurred in her vision. "Just try not to get hurt, okay?" Through her tears she saw him smile. "Not getting hurt is my #1 tactic." She swallowed. "How can you joke about it?" In a more serious tone he answered, "It's the only way to get through it." Then his features brightened once more. "Anyway, if I do get hurt, you can save me again." "I'm not a magician. If you're seriously wounded, I can't." He raised a gloved hand and placed his forefinger on her lips, repeating, "I'll comm you as soon as the battle's finished." He went to join his group, who were heading out to guard one of the airlocks. Carina commed Bryce. She'd sent him with Fern, Oriana, Jace and the mercs Halliday and Jackson to the airlock adjoining the deep sleep chamber. 30 more black dogs accompanied them, while she had kept most of Mezban's soldiers with her. Due to their commander's traitorous actions, she didn't fully trust them. "All set?" she asked him. "All set. How about you?" "We're nearly ready, just about to head out." "Got an ETA on the Regions?" "Shao reckons another 6 minutes until the ships arrive." "It's a pity we can't blast them before they get here." The soldiers in the armory were ready and awaiting orders. Carina told them to follow her. She was going to lead the defense of the main airlock. As she strode from the chamber, she continued her conversation with Bryce. "Yeah, but we can't fire a shot without any juice. Without fuel, the Bathsheba's space armaments were useless. Her human passengers were her only defense. They had to prevent the hordes of aliens from gaining a foothold inside the ship. If the Regions broke through the line of resistance at any of the airlocks, it would all be over. Like a rising tide, the aliens would sweep in, overwhelming everyone who stood in their way. At least a tough decision's been taken out of our hands, said Bryce. It wouldn't feel right to hurt the living starships. The objection had occurred to Carina too, before she realized the Bathsheba's weapons were dead anyway. The creatures were acting against their will in bringing the aliens to mount a second assault. Hurting them would feel very wrong. Yeah, I guess in a way we're lucky we don't have that option. How many ships are coming? 58. 58? She didn't answer. There was nothing she could say to make their situation seem better. And how many Regions is that? You saw the size of the ship that brought us here. She could accommodate 200 or 300 human beings. As to how many Regions would fit aboard one of them, it has to be the same amount, maybe more if they squeeze them in. Bryce seemed lost for words. When they arrive, we'll have a better idea about where they're going to concentrate their forces. I may move some troops and mages around according to where the fighting is heaviest. I'll be listening for orders. I know. Good luck. You too. He didn't close the comm, however, and neither could Carina bring herself to do it. Silence hung between them like a suffocating blanket. She had arrived at the main airlock. She checked the time. The Regions were due in only 3 minutes, yet she still couldn't say anything more to Bryce, or close the channel linking them. He was the first to crack. Carina, Don't say it! She heard his breathy sigh. We might not see each other again. It's a strong possibility, I admit. But please, let's not go there, okay? I just can't. It's too much. If you say so. Bryce's tone was pained. She was also hurting, but the idea of speaking as if for the last time only hurt worse. I'll keep you updated, she said crisply, and cut the comm. Chapter 4. Ranks of mercs faced the main portal into the Bathsheba. Carina had locked the airlock hatch, and it was her fervent hope that the simple cast would be all it took to deter the Regions. If only the aliens would burn themselves out on repeated attempts to force the hatch mechanism to open, and simply give up and go home. It was an unlikely outcome. The lock itself was weak. The Regions had repaired the acid damage from their initial attack, but the repair had been poorly done. The aliens were not used to working with inanimate starships. It wouldn't take much to breach the seal again, so a lot hung on the mage's work. But if the aliens melted the mechanisms entirely, there would be nothing to lock, and the casts would fail. Also, though the mages could cast for a long time, they couldn't do so indefinitely. Exhaustion would overcome them in the end. When the Regions poured through, they would have no energy left to split them or heal wounded soldiers. Deciding exactly when to give up casting lock in order to conserve energy would be a hard call to make. She shifted position anxiously. The Regions might also try to enter the ship via other routes. The Bathsheba had the usual exit and entry points, garbage chutes. If the aliens had no luck at the airlocks, they might try to get in via one or more of them. She had stationed a handful of mercs at each one. Entering the ship that way was now a suicide mission, but that was no deterrent to the Regions. And there was the roof to the Twilight Dome. The Regions had done a similarly bad job there as they had with the airlock mechanisms. The overhead was tight, but it wasn't strong. If the aliens possessed anything like the explosive she had used to blow it open, they could easily arrive at the same result. She hadn't stationed many defenders in that part of the ship, bargaining that the Regions weren't sufficiently technologically advanced to make bombs. 1 minute, said Shao over comm. Carina looked over her shoulder to where Darius, Nala and Parthenia crouched in a doorway, far back from the engagement zone, yet within sight. She had made the difficult decision to bring Nala along, even though the little girl couldn't do much to help. She had told her that if the aliens broke in, she was to move away from the battle, but she hadn't wanted to leave her alone or devote soldiers to her sole protection. The minute had to be nearly up. She tensed, waiting for the bump. One or more of the living starships would have to collide with the stationary Bathsheba for the aliens to attempt to board. As her thought completed, the softest of impacts shifted the deck. Another 2 or 3 bumps followed the first in quick succession. "This is it," she said over general comm. "Mages and mercs, prepare for attack." A subtle ripple passed through the soldiers as they tightened their grips on their weapons, altered stances slightly, or only stiffened. She fixed her gaze on the portal, while also registering the chrono on her HUD. The lock cast would last another 5 to 8 minutes. Before 5 minutes was up, she would cast again. Go away, or find some other hosts elsewhere. Or stick to your cold, wet, soulless planet and die out. "Where are the Regian ships?" she asked Shao. "Are they at both airlocks?" "They're everywhere." "Everywhere? All around the ship?" It didn't make any sense. The aliens should have been clustering near at least one airlock. "Not exactly all around the ship," the pilot explained. "As they got near to us, they spread out. And now they're distributing themselves along the starboard side. Can't you feel them hitting us?" Now that Shao mentioned it, Carina realized she'd continue to feel minute impacts against the ship. "So, how many are near the deep sleep chamber airlock?" "None." "Are you sure?" "I think I know how to read close-range scanner data, Lin. But I don't see why they—" Carina's words petered away as she tried to figure out what the Regians were doing. "Your guess is as good as mine." A minute or so stretched out in suspenseful silence. She felt no further impacts. "What's happening now?" "More of the same. They've all reached us, and they're pressing up against the starboard bulkhead." "What the—" "And get this, the friendly one that brought us here has joined them." For a few seconds, Carina was speechless. Eventually she said, "So she's decided to side with the Regians after all they did to her?" Before Shao could answer, a comm request arrived from Bryce. "Excuse me a sec," Carina said. Then, to Bryce, "If you were going to ask me what's happening, I don't have a clue." She related what the pilot had told her. "I think I can take a guess on what's happening." "You can?" "The Regians plan on boring us to death." She rolled her eyes. "Did you just roll your eyes?" "Quit kidding about. This is serious. I can't organize an effective defense if I don't have any idea how we might be attacked." "Sorry, the only thing I can suggest is they're waiting for something." "You could be right. Maybe they're waiting for reinforcements. It's the only explanation that makes any sense." Great, just great. They would be hard-pressed to deter the number of Regians who had already arrived, let alone even more. "I'd better talk to the other teams." She sent a comm to the team leaders, explaining the situation and telling them to remain on standby until further notice. Then she spoke to Shao, asking if there'd been any changes. "Negative. The star whales haven't moved." "Star whales? We have to give them a name. It kind of fits, don't you think?" "Yeah, whatever. I just wish they would do something." "The suspense is killing me, too." "Wait, I have an idea. Maybe the Regians are using their acid to try to burn through the hull, avoiding the airlocks altogether." Give me a second." After a pause, Shao said, "Nope. Sensors are saying everything's fine and dandy with the hull." "Shit! What the hell's going on?" Time dragged by without any movement from the Regians or the star whales. Carina's muscles ached with the tension of waiting to be attacked, and she grew more confused and apprehensive. no more living starships arrived from the Region planet. The animals remained in their positions, pressed up against the Bathsheba, though Xiao reported that occasionally one would leave, fly around for a short while, and then return to its spot, as if stretching its wings. The mercs were starting to fidget, and more than a few had allowed their pulse rifles to droop. Finally, Carina felt compelled to issue a wide at-ease command. The soldiers under her immediate control relaxed, but as one of Mezban's men lowered his weapon, the muzzle brushed the leg of a black dog. The woman objected, violently pushing him and causing him to stumble into another soldier. The man righted himself and immediately pushed her back. The black dog's visor snapped open and she yelled a string of expletives. Other black dogs began to square up against the new recruits, who turned to face them. "Cut it out!" yelled Carina. "Resume your positions!" The mercs instantly obeyed. The offended woman's visor lowered and she lifted her rifle. Mezban's men were slower to react, but 2 or 3 beats later they were also in ready mode. The wait went on. Chapter 5. In the end, Carina was forced to tell everyone to stand down. After an hour and a half of maintaining their positions, ready to defend the ship, nothing at all had happened. The Regions remained outside in their star whales, glued to the ship, but not making a single move to attack. She told Xiao to let her know immediately if there was any change in the positions of the living starships or signs the Regions were emerging. The soldiers were to remain on alert, suited up and with their weapons within reach, but otherwise to resume their regular duties. She began to walk back to the bridge to talk to Xiao, calming Bryce to meet her there. It seemed bizarre to return to normality while thousands of time-shifting aliens were hanging around, ready to seize the humans and turn them into living hosts to their offspring. But what other choice did they have? Opening the airlocks and going out to fight the Regions aboard their star whales would be madness. The enemy vastly outnumbered the soldiers, and opening the airlocks would make the Bathsheba vulnerable. Perhaps that was what the Regions were waiting for. Were the aliens besieging them, knowing that eventually they would run out of food and then they would be forced to take desperate measures? If so, the aliens were in for a long wait. The Bathsheba's stores would last for years, and when they were finally gone, they could program the waste recycling facilities to produce nutritional bars. No one would want to eat them knowing what they were made from, but it would be better than starving. Or maybe the attackers were hoping that, without fuel, the colony ship would become too cold to sustain human life. Carina guessed it would in the end, but they had emergency power. The Bathsheba was huge, and the vacuum of space was a wonderful insulator. They would be more likely to starve to death before they froze. She stepped onto the bridge, threw herself into the captain's chair and took off her helmet. Xiao seemed mildly amused. "Who'd have thought, huh? I wish I knew what they were planning. Do you want to see them?" "Sure." A moment later, a hollow of the Bathsheba appeared. The star whales clung to one side of the ship, like parasites sucking the blood from a big ugly fish. She wrinkled her nose. "What I can't figure out is, why did the one we rescued join them? Why didn't she get away while she could? When they get the chance, the Regions will board her and tie that thing to her insides again. I don't think they have yet. The scanners haven't picked up anything emerging from the ships." Carina could only shake her head in bewilderment. "So now we just wait? What choice do we have? We can't go anywhere." The bridge door opened and Bryce came in. He strode to the captain's seat, swooped down and quickly kissed Carina on the lips. "You're on duty," she admonished, though not strongly. "I'm gonna take all the chances I can get. We might all die soon." Xiao had swung her seat around to face away from them. You don't have to be so cheerful about it, said Carina. We might have more hours, days, or even months. What's not to be cheerful about? I suppose you could look at it like that. To me it feels more like we're standing in front of a firing squad, waiting for them to shoot. We've escaped from worse situations. We have? She was considering his statement, weighing up all the dangers they'd faced against being stranded without fuel, with thousands of hostile aliens at the door, when Darius sent to her. Can I talk to you, or are you busy? She mentally replied. You know you don't have to send, right? You can comm me. Oh, yeah. His soft giggle echoed in her mind. I forgot. She held up a hand to Bryce, who'd been about to say something, and calmed Darius. What do you want to tell me? I don't think we're in any danger. She had learned long ago to always listen to her spirit mage brother, even when he didn't seem to be making any sense. What makes you think we aren't in any danger, sweetheart? The starship animals are happy. I can feel their emotions, like really strong hot chocolate. Their happiness feels like hot chocolate? She asked, drawing a look of surprise from Bryce, who could only hear her half of the conversation. Xiao also peered over her shoulder, giving her a quizzical look. That's the best way I can describe it. They aren't in pain, like the one we flew in. She had been worried her youngest brother would be sensing the agony of the star whales. It had nearly crippled him before. No, they're really happy. And I figured, if they're happy, then the Regians can't be controlling them. You think they aren't being controlled? She repeated in a daze, her confusion only increasing. Could it be possible the Regians weren't piloting the star whales? And if so, why had the creatures flown to the Bathsheba? Thanks for letting me know, Darius. That's really helpful. After she related to Bryce and Xiao what Darius had said, an idea occurred. Do you think it's possible the star whales aren't even carrying Regians? That they're empty and wild, maybe? That would explain the missing attack. But if you're right, why did they come here? On my home planet, said Xiao, some birds fly in huge flocks, and when they aren't flying around they perch on trees, sometimes breaking branches with their weight. Maybe the star whales have come here to join the one we freed, and now they're just, hanging out. Carina slowly nodded. We're all suited up and armed, ready to defend the ship from a bunch of spacefaring animals who just wanted to hang out. You know, I prefer that scenario to the one we thought was happening. Me too. It's way better. But if we're right, has anything really changed? We're stuck here with no way of leaving. The Regians can still come and attack us. But we have a little more time to come up with a solution, Xiao pointed out. I guess so, said Carina, though she doubted a solution existed. They couldn't magic fuel out of nowhere, or make the Regian threat disappear. Oh shit, Xiao said, staring at her interface. What's wrong? Asked Carina, imagining the pilot was about to announce they didn't have a lucky break, that the star whales were finally moving toward the airlocks, and the Regian attack was about to begin. But the pilot didn't answer. She adjusted the controls on the holo display. The image of the Bathsheba, which had remained hanging in the air, disappeared and was replaced by the earlier holo of the Regian planetary system and surrounding space. We forgot about it, she said, but the creepy cloud is still creeping up on us. The long tongue of anomalous space was reaching out toward the Bathsheba like a frog catching a fly in slow motion. Damn it, Carina breathed. The threat to their safety hadn't gone away. It had only reverted to the previous one. How long till it reaches us? The rate of expansion isn't steady, Xiao answered. The computer estimates the tip will hit the ship between 48 minutes and 3 hours 15 from now. Chapter 6. "Where's Parthenia?" Carina asked as soon as she entered her family's suite. Her other siblings were all here and in the midst of their usual activities, but her oldest sister was nowhere to be seen. "Is she in the bathroom?" "We don't know where she is," Oriana replied. "She said she was going to see a friend, but that's all." Carina wondered if the friend was the boy she'd mistakenly defended Parthenia from. If so, she couldn't blame her sister for wanting to be with him in the current circumstances, when no one knew how long they had left. Yet she'd hoped the family could stay together while they waited out the latest crisis. The space-time anomaly was stretching out toward them, and it seemed likely the ship would eventually be enveloped by the cloud. What might happen then was anyone's guess. The Bathsheba was completely motionless, and there was no threat of her moving away while affected by the anomaly. But did the cloud affect living and non-living things in the same way? And if half the ship were covered by the cloud, would that part slip forward or backward in time, shearing away from the unaffected half? A hull breach like that would mean near instant death for everyone aboard. She sat next to Darius, who was lying on his front and playing a card game with Nala, though she also had an interface open and was reading while waiting for her brother to take his turn. "Do the star whales feel happy?" Carina asked him. He looked upward for a moment as he sought out the answer and then nodded. "Yeah, it's a nice feeling." She wished he could communicate with the creatures. Then she would have a much better idea of their intentions, and maybe she could ask them a huge favor. Were they really just hanging out? If only she could send to the star whales. When she was a little girl, she'd often tried to speak to animals by casting send, but always without success. Once or twice she'd also tried the cast with humans, though without Nine-Eye's knowledge. The old lady would have been furious with her for taking the risk. The result had been the same. Send only worked between mages. On the other hand, anything was worth a try. The only problem was how to do it. If the object of the cast wasn't in sight, the mage needed some kind of connection to him or her, usually a personal item of some kind. Yet they'd taken no part of the star whale with them. Without something to tie them to the ship mentally, they had no way to reach it. Except, maybe, Darius. Something in her tone made him put down his cards and look at her. "Can you feel which is the star whale we travelled on, separately from the others?" "Oh, sure, I can feel her. That one's our friend. She likes me and you because we took away her pain. She can tell us apart from the other humans?" "Of course," Darius replied, his look indicating she was being a little dumb. His connection with the creature appeared to be stronger than a simple sensitivity to her feelings. "So," she said tentatively, "if you tried to send to her, she might understand you?" "What do you want me to say to her?" "Could you ask her what she and her friends are doing here, and if they could help us?" "Okay, I think I can remember that." He got up and padded to a jug of elixir on a side cabinet. He lifted the lid, poured a small amount into a glass, and then drank it. As he closed his eyes, an expression of concentration appeared on his young face. "What's Darius casting?" Oriana asked. She and Fern had been drawing designs for clothes they wanted to print, oblivious to the conversation between Carina and her brother. Carina hadn't yet broadcast the bad news about the approaching cloud. There didn't seem to be any point, at least not until the approach of the anomaly was imminent, when she would have to say something. Everyone should have a chance to say their last goodbyes in case the worst happened. "He's trying to send to the creature we enthralled to bring us here." Oriana nodded and returned her attention to her design, but then she looked up again and said, "Why?" "I'll tell you in a minute." Carina focused on Darius, whose lips were silently moving as a crease formed between his eyebrows. "That'll never work," said Fern. "Believe me, When we were on Ithia, I tried to send to our pets lots of times. I thought it would be cool to talk to them. No luck. I'm not so sure you're right, Carina said, watching Darius. The young boy was clearly having a conversation. Unless he was talking to himself, he could only be chatting with the star whale. Suddenly, his lips stopped moving and he opened his eyes. What did you want me to ask her? What? You could talk to her? What did she say? First I said hello, just to check if she could hear me, and I found out she could. Then I told her my name, and I asked her if she was doing okay. Fern laughed. Hurry up and get to the important part. Let him speak, Nala admonished. She said she was doing okay, said Darius, unfazed by Fern's urging. And she asked me how I was doing. I said I was fine, and I thanked her kindly for bringing us to our ship. Fern let out a heavy sigh. And she said, Darius went on, she would have brought us here anyway, even if we hadn't made her do it. Oops, Carina thought, feeling bad for enthralling the creature. I hope you apologized for what we did. Of course. It's cool to talk to her. Her voice sounds raspy and deep, like a big frog. I don't hear any words, but somehow I understand what she's saying. And then did you ask her what she and her friends are doing, and if they might help us? No, I forgot that part. Oh my goodness, send to her again. Hurry up. While Darius was sipping elixir to continue his chat with the star whale, she calmed Xiao. Any news on the cloud? Yeah, but it isn't good. It's speeding up. It's like it wants to grab us. What's its ETA now? At the current rate of acceleration, Xiao paused. 8 minutes 52 seconds to contact with the starboard bow. The star whales were clustered to starboard. Hope sparked in Carina's chest, but she kept it to herself, not knowing if she was being too optimistic. Should I tell everyone? Xiao asked. Not yet. We don't even know if it's going to hurt us. I was thinking, if the Regions evolved to timeshift due to the regular encroachment of the cloud, it must exert a selective pressure on them. I haven't figured it out yet, but I believe it has something to do with the planet's rotation. If they were moved out of the regular progression of time, would they remain in sync with the planet's surface? Wouldn't the planet also be time-shifted, but perhaps not in the same way? Who knows? Then Carina found she couldn't contain her excitement any longer. We might have a solution to our problem. Stand by. As she closed the comm, she turned to Darius, who had finished his second conversation and was waiting to report to her. She said, would we like her and her friends to push us away from the space bubble? I tried to ask her about the other stuff, but she said there isn't a lot of time. Yes, Carina replied urgently. Tell her yes. Could she please help us? With a look of quiet stoicism, Darius took a third drink of elixir. What space bubble? Asked Oriana. You know the thing that affected Lomang, Mezban and the soldiers when we were escaping from the Region planet? Oriana's eyes grew wide. That's coming near us? Why didn't you say anything? I was kind of distracted by the impending Region attack. And then, well, what could you have done about it even if you knew? Fern asked his twin. If I'm about to vanish, I want to be told about it. As far as Carina understood, Lomang, Mezban and the others hadn't actually vanished. They'd suffocated in space while the blood boiled in their veins and air exploded from their lungs. But she judged it wasn't the right time to correct her sister. The ship jerked and then slowly began to move. It worked! Nala shouted. We're moving! She jumped down from the sofa and ran to give Darius a hug. You're so clever! He smiled shyly and flushed pink. You saved us again, Carina said. What would we do without you? Chapter 7. Where they were going, Carina didn't know. The most important thing was they were moving away from the space-time anomaly, pushed by the star whales. When they were far beyond it, the Bathsheba's computer might be able to recognize the surrounding star patterns and tell them where they were. They might also find an inhabited planet where they could stop and refuel. The star whales hadn't said how long they were prepared to help the humans, but they couldn't rely on the creatures' benevolence forever. When they'd refueled, they would plot a course for Earth. She was in the Twilight Dome, looking up at the stars. The star whales weren't visible from this vantage point, but she could imagine the huge, silent creatures flying them onward, ripples pulsating through the thick frills running along their sides. She'd come to the dome to see how the repairs were coming along. No one had managed to fabricate the transparent material of the original covering, and so men and women in EVA suits had replaced blown-out areas with sections of regular hull. The remaining unharmed area of window could be replaced with hull material too. Its weakness was a liability. If the ship were attacked again, that would be the first place to be targeted. She had debated with herself long and hard about blocking up the transparent ceiling. In the end, she'd put the question to a vote, and the majority had voted to retain it. Without even asking around, she knew why. Years of space travel inside glorified tin cans resulted in a hunger for wide vistas and open skies. The ability to look out upon a starscape, no matter how cold and hard the view, wasn't something many were prepared to give up in a hurry, despite the risk. And with the many, many years of journeying they had ahead, the few small pleasures they had would make a big difference. "I thought I might find you here," said a familiar voice. She smiled and turned to see Bryce. "I was just checking to see how things are going. They're nearly finished." "I can see." His gaze wandered the overhead. Then he looked at her. "Don't you ever stop and take a rest? You've been roaming the ship for days, organising people left, right and centre ever since we got away from the Regian system." "There's a lot to organise. Someone has to do it." "Is there really? Don't you think you can trust the black dogs to figure out a few things for themselves, like fixing the airlocks, working out a meal prep rota, etc.? His gaze felt uncomfortably piercing in the soft light. She gave a little laugh as she faltered. "I guess so, just a few." He squeezed her arm. "Don't get me wrong, everyone appreciates what you're doing, but you deserve a break. You could spend more time with the kids, for instance, especially now Parthenia isn't around as much as usual." "Oh, she's seeing that young merc?" "Yeah, Camel Stanton. He seems like a good guy, and I think he's only a year younger than you." "She's growing up," said Carina, sidestepping the jibe. Bryce snorted with laughter. "You're only 3 years older than her." "There's more to growing up than aging. I lived a lifetime before I joined the Black Dogs, while Parthenia had servants waiting on her. You don't know the half of it." "No, but I can guess. And that's even more reason for you to have some downtime now and then, huh?" The idea of not spending all her waking moments doing all she could to safeguard those in her care was appealing, but she wasn't sure she could let go so easily. "I can try." "Good. I knew you'd see sense." He glanced upward at the men and women working on the ship's hull, and then took her hand and drew her to the edge of the room, where everything was in deep shadow. "Now, I don't want you to feel pressured. I know you're not ready to get married yet, but I want to give you something." He slid a hand into his pants pocket, pulled out a strip of fabric and handed it to her. She took the strip and angled it toward the lights to see it more clearly. It was like a hair ribbon, only shorter and made from many threads woven into a geometric pattern. The distant beams reflected from the gold and silver threads, among other rich colours. "It's beautiful. Where did you get it?" Had he taken it from the Zenobia? Lomang's ship had carried many rare and expensive items. Nowhere. I made it. Her eyes grew round. You made it? Or do you mean you designed it and printed it? No, I made it. With these. He waggled his fingers. I took threads from other fabrics here and there and printed some others, but I wove them together myself. Took me months. Oh, Bryce, thank you. It's amazing. No one ever made anything for me before. She was choking up. Do I put it around my neck? Through blurring vision, she could see small hook and eye clasps sewn into the ends. As she asked him the question, a long-forgotten memory began to surface. Well, before you put it on, you need to understand what it is. You remember I told you I'd talk to Jace about mage marriages? Before I made my badly timed proposal. A guilty twinge hit. It wasn't badly timed, She sniffed. Her simple visit to check on the state of the dome was turning into an emotional roller coaster. It's okay, it doesn't matter now. He looked around at the nearby furniture. Let's sit down. They walked a few steps to a sofa and sat on it, facing each other, their knees touching. She put the woven strip down on her lap. Bryce's expression was intense as he gazed into her eyes. Jace told me about a mage tradition that takes place before marriage. The memory that had begun to manifest grew stronger. She was a child again, at home with Nai in the ramshackle 2-roomed hut that had been their home. She had noticed something her grandmother was wearing and was asking her about it. She recalled the old woman's reply. I think I know what you're going to tell me. Okay, well, let me finish, and we'll see if you're right. He took her hands in his. Jace said the tradition is, if a mage man wants to express his love for someone, he weaves something called a love band. If the band is accepted, it means the feeling is reciprocated. Mage women sometimes weave the bands, but it's usually a guy thing. It's not an engagement as such, just a statement of feelings. So I made you that. I was going to give it to you that day on the Duchess. And I pushed you away. I'm so sorry. Don't be sorry. I already told you we don't even have to get married. But after what Jace told me, I still want to give you the band. A fat tear welled up in her eye, slipped out and ran down her cheek. She swallowed. My grandmother had one of these. She never took it off. I didn't know my grandfather. He died before I was born. I asked her once what the band was, but all she would tell me was that I would find out one day. My grandfather must have made it for her. Another tear slipped out. Bryce reached up and wiped it away with his thumb. Isn't that something to be happy about? He must have loved your grandmother very much. She slowly shook her head. The main reason I asked Nai about her band was because I remembered Ma had worn one around her neck too. It was one of my few memories of her. I realized just now that when I met her again, she wasn't wearing it any longer. Stefan Scherer must have taken it from her. Bryce's expression softened to sadness, and he laid a hand on her arm. Carina's head dropped forward as she gave in to her grief. One day she might move on from mourning her mother, but the time hadn't come yet. Bryce wrapped his arms around her and she laid her head on his shoulder. Some time later, when her emotions were coming under control, he said, "This isn't going as well as I'd hoped." "It's not your fault. Could you put it on for me?" He took the band from her lap and she turned her back toward him. Pushing her hair to one side, he looped the band around her neck and fastened it. She touched her new woven necklace and faced him. "How does it look?" "Better now you're wearing it." She smiled and wiped the tears from her face. "Smooth. I like it." He leaned toward her and she met him halfway. As they kissed, she momentarily forgot about Ma and her family and the responsibility weighing on her to get everyone aboard the Bathsheba to Earth in one piece. Chapter 8. Calverley had been given the all clear by the medics, and now Carina had a difficult decision to make. Should she return the Shura Admiral to the brig or allow him the freedom of the ship? Putting him back in stasis was out of the question. He'd only barely survived from his previous stint, and running even one of the stasis capsules would waste power from the emergency generators. The energy they produced was already taken up, maintaining life support and sanitation systems, computing, comm and scanners, and simply keeping the lights on. She decided to go and talk to Calverley before deciding what to do. It had been a long time since they'd spoken more than a few words to each other. She had assigned him a guard, but she wasn't sure it was necessary. When she saw him in the waiting room of the sick bay, she was shocked. The Admiral was already an old man, but he looked as though he'd aged another 10 years. Strictly speaking, this wasn't possible. Aging slowed down to an almost imperceptible rate while in deep sleep. Though Calverley had been in his stasis capsule for many decades, he should only have aged a month or two at most. He looked up at her from under hooded eyes. He was seated at the centre of a bench, frail hands gripping his knees. His pink scalp showed through its covering of thin snow-white hair, and deep wrinkles corrugated his face and neck. He looked fragile and vulnerable, yet he was a person of high intelligence and great mental strength and determination. He would never have risen so high within the Shura ranks otherwise. She also recalled he believed himself to be of high integrity, justifying the cruel control the clan exercised on the worlds they dominated as for the greater good. Now he had had plenty of time to reflect. Did his self-delusion persist? He gazed at her with watery, bloodshot eyes. The young private who stole the Dirkson's secret weapon from Banner's moon. You want my permission to visit your boyfriend in the men's quarters again? She sat down, straight-faced despite his attempt at humour. I'd almost forgotten our first meeting. You had? Perhaps that's not too surprising. I'm just a very ordinary old man, and not very memorable, whereas you, my dear, you are exceptional. If only I'd been aware just how exceptional. Was he attempting flattery in the hope of gaining her favour? He chuckled. There's no need to look so suspicious, Lin. I was being sincere. I didn't come here for compliments. I'll be frank. Now you're better, I don't know what to do with you. You were my enemy, and maybe you still are. I'm curious, if our roles were reversed, what would you do? He took no time to consider, replying reflexively, if our roles were reversed, you wouldn't be alive. I would have left you to die in the Dirkson castle. I may have given the order to put you out of your misery rather than leave you to starve to death. But that would have been the extent of my mercy. She was taken aback. You wouldn't have rescued someone in the pitiful state I found you in? You were, perhaps still are, my enemy. Why would I have saved you? His look was cold and hard. At first she struggled to answer. He had a good point. The Shuras must have known how Stefan was treating Ma and her siblings, yet they'd done nothing. She couldn't have expected better treatment if she'd been recaptured. Why should she have saved Calverley, knowing he was their representative and, if he were given the chance, he would have recaptured her? Yet when she'd discovered him near death in the ancient mage stronghold on Ostalon, the threat of his existence hadn't been uppermost in her mind. What about compassion, sympathy, kindness? We might have been enemies, but we weren't opposing sides in that battle. You were a fellow human being in need. You'd suffered terribly for weeks and were in no position to hurt anyone. Only a monster would have left you there. Calverley's expression softened. He broke eye contact and nodded. Only a monster indeed. When he spoke no more, she said, "You told me once that what the Shurers were doing was justified, that they were bringing civilization to the galactic sector, and the sacrifices made would be worth it in the end. Do you still believe that?" Continuing to avert his gaze, the old man replied, "To be perfectly honest, I am no longer sure what I believe." His answer wasn't satisfying. She felt she wanted more from him, something firmer to reassure herself it was safe to allow him his freedom. She couldn't tell if he was remorseful over his previous behavior or if he was only hedging, hoping to exploit her altruism, which he appeared to consider foolish. She couldn't read him, and she was reluctant to enthrall him to get truthful answers, given his age and ill health. She didn't want to permanently damage his mind. Was her reluctance another example of misguided kindness? Perhaps, in order to secure a safe future for my family, you think I should be ruthless like you. I am in no position to advise you on what to do. I wasn't asking for your advice. She sighed, frustrated. Calverley leaned back and looked her in the eyes once more. I understand what your dilemma is, but I'm afraid I'm unable to help you. Why? She begged. Why won't you give me a straight answer? Don't you want me to stop viewing you as a threat? The problem is, you want to stop viewing me as a threat. You want to do the right thing, the good thing, but your fear of making a mistake is holding you back. You don't want to be responsible for someone coming to harm due to a decision you made. He narrowed his eyes as he continued. During my days in my little cell on your ship, my access to information was limited, and I wasn't prepared to converse with the 3 maniacs who were my fellow inmates. I've gleaned some information from the medics about what happened while I was in stasis, but again I remain hazy on the details. However, what I do know is you, your family, and most of your Merc band have survived. Apparently your choices have been effective so far. She thought of Cadwallader, Atoy, and the others who had suffered and died. But at what cost? I said before I wasn't in a position to give you advice, said Calverley, staring intensely. But that isn't true. I was once where you are, Lin. I held the lives of many men and women in my hands, some of whom were close to me. If I am to tell you anything, let it be this. People will die under your command. It is inevitable. Yet you must make your decisions and live without regret. Do not waste your time in hesitation and self-doubt. If you wish to succeed in your endeavours, you cannot afford that luxury. He coughed a little as if to clear his throat, but then the cough turned into a fit of hacking and retching, attracting the attention of the medics. 2 ran in to attend to him. One held a medical scanner against his back, while the other gave him something to inhale. When Calverley finally recovered, he looked weaker and older than ever. I think we need to take another look at you, one of the medics said. Come inside for a re-evaluation. 1 more night in recovery won't hurt. The ex-admiral stood up, though he remained hunched over, and the medics supported him by his elbows as they guided him into the centre. Carina also stood. Her mind was made up. If he's better tomorrow and you discharge him, he can go wherever he wants. I won't send guards. Chapter 9. As she left the sick bay, a notification sounded from Carina's comm, and she ran toward the bridge. The Bathsheba's computer had finally recognized their position. By the time she arrived, Xiao was already at the pilot station, her attention focused on her screen. As Carina entered the bridge, she threw a gleeful grin over her shoulder. "You have to see this!" Returning her attention to her console, she added, "I'll show you the holo. Take a seat." Carina settled into the captain's chair, and moments later a starscape hollow appeared. The bridge lights dimmed, causing the stars to become the brightest light sources in the room. None of the patterns jumped out as familiar. The area nearest to her was sparsely populated by perhaps 80 or 90 stars. In the farther regions the density thickened until a blaze of suns blanketed the extreme edge of the hollow. Pretty. Now are you going to tell me where we are? Xiao stood up and walked through the image before pointing at a spot roughly 3/4 of the way down the blanket of white dots. Naturally, the Bathsheba was far too small to appear on the hollow at its current scale, but the computer had provided a green spot to display her position. Oh, really? Carina had been expecting their ship to be somewhere within the thinly populated area. Yeah, I know, right? Who'd have thought we were travelling through such a crowded neighbourhood? Xiao took a few steps toward Carina and touched a point of red light in a sparsely populated area. The coordinates for Earth's system put it here. Carina stood up. That's Earth's star? Yep. Xiao's tone was triumphant. They called it Sol. That's really it? Carina joined her at the side of the hollow. Xiao laughed and patted her back. It really is. Assuming the coordinates are correct, of course. Her pulse thudding through her veins, Carina reached out in the semi-darkness to touch the brilliant spot of red. Her finger met nothing but air, yet a thrill passed through her, sending prickles through her skin. How long had she wanted to find the home of mages? How long had she yearned to return there? She couldn't even remember when she'd first thought of the idea. She'd been so young. The notion that Earth was finally within her sights was so incredible it seemed unreal. And yet, she looked at the opposite side of the hollow, where Xiao had said the Bathsheba was located. Though it was only a few meters away, she knew the distances represented were many, many light years, which meant more time in deep sleep before they reached their final destination. It was one thing to see Earth's sun in a hollow. Getting there was another thing entirely. She returned to the captain's chair and increased the lights to their former brightness. The hollow faded and became a vague block that faintly glimmered. What does it mean? She gestured at the 3D image. What scale is that? The largest the computer generates, but it's cool to see the ship and Earth in the same picture, right? It turns out the Regians didn't take us on a direct route to their planet after they hijacked the ship. It looks like they wandered around quite a bit. We were never 70-odd years off course. They must have gotten lost. They had a lucky break when they hit upon a colony ship full of humans, probably on their way to a familiar backwater planet. But after taking the ship over, they didn't understand how to navigate it. They were used to relying on the star whale's homing instinct, or something like that. What I don't understand, said Xiao, is how did they live so long on the Bathsheba while they were trying to find their way home? The ship's stores don't seem to have been touched. It's possible that the Regians don't eat after they've reached their adult stage. Some insect species are like that. They only eat during the juvenile stages. Her stomach squirmed as she recalled what the young Regians ate. Her initial elation all but gone, she continued. We can't expect the star whales to push us all the way to Earth. No, Xiao agreed. That wouldn't be reasonable. Have they indicated when they might leave? According to my brother, they've said they'll take us to a safe place. All the other mages had tried to speak to the star whales, Carina included, but none had succeeded. A safe place of our choosing or theirs? That isn't clear, but if we can give them a destination, maybe they'll take us there. What information do we have on the nearest systems? Not a lot, and it has to be decades out of date, but take a look for yourself. As you'll see, you have a choice to make. Carina wanted to talk to the Black Dogs and the newly joined members of the band Mezban's ex-soldiers before selecting the place where they would try to refuel the Bathsheba. But before she approached them, she wanted to mull over her scant knowledge. It was odd that, when Cadwallader had been alive, she had fought his attempts to be more democratic about the taking of significant decisions. Something in her had changed, and now she was eager to hear other opinions. Was it because it would have been the lieutenant colonel, not her, who would have borne the brunt of the blame if things had gone wrong? The thought made her uncomfortable. Would she have been so cavalier if their roles had been reversed? Calverley's comment about her need to act ethically and her fear of the consequences of the calls she made had struck home. After wandering around the ship, thinking over the new information, she received a comm from Parthenia. "Where are you? Dinner's nearly over. If you don't get here soon, Oriana and Fern will have eaten everything." "Shoot!" She checked the time. "I'll be there in a couple of minutes. Tell them if they don't leave me something, I'll transport them to the other side of the ship without any elixir, and they'll have to walk all the way back." She began to jog toward the family suite. As she ran, she thought over another decision she had to make, one that had been bothering her since Bryce had given her the love band. When she arrived, the dining table was indeed mostly empty. It was no big deal. Oriana and Fern were growing fast and always hungry, and printing more to eat didn't take long. She wasn't even feeling particularly hungry, perhaps because she was nervous about the announcement she had to make. The children were in happy spirits. Darius and Nala were bouncing in their seats, their slender attention spans for something as boring as eating already exhausted. And Oriana and Fern were reciting lines from a comedy vid someone had copied across from the Duchess's database. Parthenia's head was down over an interface, probably chatting with Camille. Carina reminded herself she needed to invite the young man to dinner soon. Bryce was also here, she was happy to see. His presence wasn't unusual, especially when he knew she was busy and might not make it back for family mealtimes. He slept in the suite with her, and Darius, and Nala too. She took the seat left empty and reached for a serving bowl that still contained a little soup. "Do you want some more?" asked Bryce. "I can get it for you." "No, this is fine." She spooned the last of the soup into her bowl and picked up the remaining piece of bread. Oriana and Fern's comic turn came to an end and they burst into giggles. She dipped bread into her soup, took a bite and chewed as she waited for the laughter to die down. "I want to run an idea past you guys," she said, before there was a chance for more chatter to start up. Parthenia lifted her gaze from her interface. "What's that?" She put down her piece of bread and laced her fingers together in front of her bowl. "It's mostly going to affect Darius and Nala and," she added, focusing on them, "I don't want you to be afraid to speak up if you don't like it." Oriana shot a puzzled look at her twin. "Okay," said Carina, but then a sudden bout of nerves hit her. Was she doing the right thing? Was it too soon for Darius and Nala? She pushed through her trepidation. "This suite contains 3 bedrooms, right? Parthenia has one to herself, Oriana and Fern share a room, and Darius, Nala, Bryce and I are all squeezed into the 3rd bedroom." She grimaced. "It's kind of cramped, isn't it?" Bryce, clearly catching on about where she was going, rested his elbow on the table and his chin on his palm, and began to watch her with amused eyes. "But next door," she raised her eyebrows, heralding the solution to the problem she'd outlined. "Next door is a 1-bedroom cabin." Parthenia smiled wryly and looked down at her screen. "Oh," said Nala, "that could be for you and Bryce, and then Darius and I could share a room, and we wouldn't be so squashed up anymore." "Exactly." Carina was greatly relieved she hadn't been forced to spell it out. Fern burst into laughter again and whispered something in Oriana's ear. She pushed him away, chuckling and looking somewhat embarrassed. "What do you think, Darius?" Carina asked. Her brother had relied upon her and Bryce for comfort while he slept. She hadn't begrudged the inconvenience for a second. Both he and Nala had been through a lot, especially considering they were so young. "If it's going to upset you, we won't do it."
No, it's okay."
He shrugged as if unconcerned, though she guessed his attitude might be at least partly due to a reluctance to look babyish in front of his siblings. "If you're scared in the night, you can always come to us. Just," she glanced at Bryce, "use the doorcom first." That evening, after tucking in Darius and Nala and saying good night to the rest of the children, she joined Bryce in the suite next door. He'd been taking a shower, and as she closed the door he came out of the bathroom in a robe. "I like this idea. Are the two little ones really okay with it?" "They seem to be. We'll find out soon enough if they aren't. They'll let us know, that's for sure. But they haven't had any nightmares for a while now, so I thought we could try. They're tough little cookies." "They are, and I hope they're okay." He took her in his arms. "It's nice to have some privacy for a change." She returned his embrace. They kissed, and soon she felt as though she was melting into him. How long had they waited for this? Passion surged in her as Bryce clasped her closer. She recalled the skinny adolescent who had followed her out of the tavern on Ithia, when she'd been so drunk she'd barely been able to stand, citing his concern for her well-being. She also recalled his attempt to steal from her, desperate for money to buy the meds that were keeping him alive. He'd come a long way since then. They both had, and she could hardly reconcile her memory with the strong young man holding her close. Her fears and worries vanished to nothing, and there was only the yearned-for intimacy of the moment. Long minutes later she said softly, "You know, the first time we kissed, I thought, he's really good at this." "You did?" He chuckled. "And what do you think now?" "You haven't changed." He pulled her close again, slipping his hands under her shirt and up the bare skin of her back. He began to kiss her neck, starting at the corner of her jaw and working his way down. When he reached the love band, he paused. "Do you want me to take this off?" She shook her head. "Never." Chapter 10. Carina faced the assembled men and women. Some faces were very familiar, like Halliday's, Jackson's, and many other black dogs, while some had been growing in familiarity to her over the weeks the star whales had been pushing the Bathsheba through the cosmos. The latter group comprised Mezban's former soldiers. They had supposedly joined the Merc band, but they sat in their own group. All were male, as Lomang's crew had been. She guessed that on their planet women rarely joined the military. They were large-headed and deep-voiced, and they grew out their beards, grooming them into distinctive styles. Jace, Bryce, and her siblings sat near the back of the large meeting room. Calverley was present as well. The old man sat alone in a corner, his arms and legs folded as he watched her closely. She cleared her throat. "Thanks for coming, everyone. I'd especially like to welcome the new members of the Black Dogs. It's good to have you here without the necessity of trying to kill you." Her dark, humoured quip drew chuckles from the original Black Dogs, but the soldiers who had worked for Mezban remained stony-faced. In his corner at the back of the room, Calverley frowned deeply. She swallowed and continued, "We've been extremely lucky. Just when we thought we faced another battle with the Regians, one we might not have been able to win, we've had a reprieve. What's more, we have an unexpected ally, a flock of spacefaring creatures who helped us get away. I don't know exactly why the animals are helping us or for how long, so it's imperative we refuel as soon as possible. We finally know our position, and we have information on local systems where we can buy fuel and supplies. But where we should go isn't clear. We're all in this together, and the choice could have wide-reaching, perhaps devastating repercussions. Unfortunately, I'm no Cadwallader. I don't have his years of experience. While he might have been able to figure out the best place to go, I want your input before I come to a decision. I asked you here to get your opinions. One of Mezban's men stood up. His arms were crossed over his broad chest, and he fixed her with an imperious look. I have a question. His fellow soldiers were gazing up at him calmly, as if knowing what he was about to say. It seemed he was their unofficial representative. What's your name? Vazia Rebane. Go ahead, Rebane. We want to know when Papu will be released. Lomang's brother had been residing in the Bathsheba's brig ever since they'd retaken the ship. She assumed he shared the same home planet as Mezban's soldiers, and they clearly held him in some regard if they were asking for him to be set free. She had no intention of releasing the man, though she hadn't given his ultimate fate much consideration. On the other hand, she didn't want to piss off a bunch of trained killers. That's a discussion for another time. We would like to address it now, said Rebane, placing both hands on the seat back in front of him, leaning forward and glaring at her. Indistinct, angry murmurs rumbled through the black dogs in response to his aggressive tone. Appearing to sense he was skirting dangerous ground, Rebane returned to an upright position and let his arms hang at his sides as he said, Papu is not a bad man. It was only that he loved and followed his brother, obeying him in everything. Whatever he did while under Lomang's influence should be disregarded. You can trust him. His fellow soldiers nodded and turned to Carina for her response. She recalled the giant's hands on her shoulders, forcing her to her knees, and his long, strong fingers around her neck, squeezing the life from her. Trust him? She wasn't going to do that in a hurry. In the corner of the room, Calverley's full attention was upon her. His eyes seemed to bore into her soul. Meet with me later, she said to Rebane, and I'll hear what you have to say. For now we have a more urgent decision to make. After a second or two of hesitation, he sat down. Neither he nor the rest of his group seemed satisfied, but she didn't care. She had avoided the problem for now. According to the ship's database, 3 colonized systems are within roughly equal distance from us. We should be able to get what we want at any of them, but the information we have is hundreds of years old and could be wildly inaccurate. Those of you who worked for Mezban are from this sector. If you know anything about these places, I want to hear it. And anyone else, even if you just feel you have something to contribute, speak out. We don't know how much longer we can rely on the Star Whale's kindness. My final choice has to be a good one, because it may be the only chance we get to continue our voyage. Her words subdued the room to complete silence. She nodded at Xiao, who dimmed the lights and opened the first hollow. In the space next to her, a pair of suns appeared, slowly circling each other. Between them could be seen a huge gas giant, but this was not the object of her interest. Aberama 12, 1 habitable planet, Kvarkan, 0.7 standard G, primarily aquatic, with oceans covering 92% of the surface. Last recorded population, 71 million. Major exports, fish, seaweed, minerals. I've heard of Kvarkan, said a voice she didn't recognize. For half its orbit, the planet is in constant daylight, and it only experiences periods of darkness during the other half. Do you know anything else about it? It has a bad rep. My dad was a trader, and he told me never to go there. Said the inhabitants are constantly at each other's throats, and you can't trust any of them. She squinted into the darkness, trying to find the voice's owner. but all she could see was black silhouettes of Mezban's men. "Thanks. Maybe you'll know something about the other planets too." The man was silent. She asked Xiao to move to the next hollow. Aberama 8. The original stars were replaced by a single G-type, orbited by 10 or 12 planets, just visible in the glare. This system has 2 habitable worlds, one cold, rocky and 1.3 standard G, and the other cloudy and hot, with 0.85 standard. "Gog and Magog," said the man who had spoken before. "That's right. What can you tell us?" "Magog's the hot one. The elite there inhabit cloud cities. Everyone else lives on the surface. Dad would mostly buy animal hides and seeds of an indigenous wild plant from them and sell them computer parts. I think they have good manufacturing bases for other goods, though. Gog is barely populated. It's too cold for most crop plants, and the population lives in domes." She checked the scarce information she had, which seemed to chime in with what the man had said. The Bathsheba's data stated Gog's population was a mere 2 million, while Magog was nearly 1 billion. A small population wasn't necessarily a negative. The fewer people who knew about a colony ship preparing for a long voyage, the better. But it could mean they might not be able to buy everything they needed. The thick, viscous fluid that filled the stasis capsules contained highly specialized, complex chemicals. "Anything else?" "That's all I know." She asked Xiao to bring up the 3rd hollow. An F-type star lit up the room. "Aberama 3. "Aberama got about a bit," growled a voice she recognized as Halliday's, drawing chuckles from the other black dogs. She continued, not acknowledging the interruption. "Just one habitable planet here, Justice." "I don't like the sound of that," Halliday quipped, apparently emboldened by the positive reception of his previous joke. "Halliday," she said over the resulting laughter, narrowing her eyes at him as he shifted about uncomfortably in the front row. "Unless you have something useful to say, shut up." She looked in the rough direction of the man who had spoken before. "The guy whose father is a trader. What do you know about Justice?" "It says here it's a high-grav planet, 1.9 standard, population unknown. Exports mainly rare and precious metals and gems." "It's young, highly volcanic. My dad did good business there, but I remember him saying he was never allowed to go planet-side." She wondered why. World governments sometimes made disembarkation illegal due to safety concerns. Some planets were largely lawless places. In other cases, the governments had something to hide, like human trafficking or illegal gene splicing, such as creating human-animal hybrids. That practice had been outlawed in her native sector, and she guessed that Geril's sector was probably the same. Yet the mention of gems had piqued her interest. She intended to pay for what she needed with the remaining ember gems. Lomang had said the precious stones weren't found anywhere else in the sector. Justice sounded like exactly the place that would understand and appreciate their rarity. But she didn't want to make a decision without further input from the others. She told Xiao to shut down the hollow projector and bring up the lights. Perching on the edge of the table, she said, "Okay, let's talk." "No!" shouted Rebane, suddenly rising to his feet once more. "First you release Papu, then we talk about other things." "I told you we would discuss Papu later. Sit down." "You're going to keep him locked up, no matter what we say. You think you can pacify us with delays and prevarication. You cannot. I have explained to you that our friend isn't responsible for whatever offences he committed. Now you must let him go." The black dogs were sending Rebane and his companions dark glances. A fight was brewing, and if it occurred, she couldn't see a way back from it. The two groups of soldiers would be enemies, and the atmosphere on the ship would be riven with tension and enmity. Yet she was more angry than apprehensive. The Mercs had saved Mezban's soldiers from a horrible death on the Regian planet. That fact appeared to have been entirely forgotten. What she wanted to do was to throw the whole lot of them in the brig, or even space them. Such a large number of military men would be a constant danger, but the future as she saw it was vague and probably hazardous. She might need every one of Mezban's soldiers before long. I shouldn't have to remind you that you're guests on this ship. I told you I would discuss Papu's situation with you, and I will, later. Then I will listen to whatever you have to say. You have my guarantee, but not now. She locked gazes with the man. Suspense over who would be the first to break stretched out between them, and the silence grew painful. It was a pivotal moment. She had to demonstrate complete control, or face insubordination and the threat of mutiny forever onward. Finally, Rebane looked away. She relaxed, but her triumph was short-lived. Rather than sitting down as she expected him to, Rebane said something in his own language to the men around him. As one group they stood up and shuffled out, their de facto leader at their head. She mentally cursed. During the murmurings of those who remained in the room, she gave Halliday, Jackson, and some other black dogs new orders. The Mercs rose and followed in the wake of Mezban's men. Not all of Mezban's soldiers had left. One man remained, though he looked self-conscious. "Are you the one whose father is a trader?" When he nodded, she said, "What's your name?" "Vigo Justice." "Thanks for staying, Justice." She addressed the room. "So, where do we go?" Chapter 11. Camille led Parthenia by the hand down a rarely frequented passageway. "I don't understand what the big secret is," she said. "I've been everywhere on the ship. You can't take me anywhere that's new to me." Camille had seemed excited about inviting her to go somewhere with him after the meeting, but she wasn't feeling it. "This place isn't new to you." "Then why won't you tell me where we're going?" He was frustratingly silent. She dug in her heels, forcing him to stop, and pulled her hand out of his. "If you don't tell me, I'm not going a step farther." Camille turned to face her, looking hurt. "It's only a bit of fun. There's no need to be so uptight." "I'm not uptight. Do you really expect me to just follow you wherever you want to take me, the two of us entirely alone? I hardly know you." His wounded expression deepened. "Hardly know me? I thought I meant more to you than that." A pang of guilt hit her. "You do mean a lot to me, even though we've only been seeing each other for a few weeks. But think about it from my point of view. You're much bigger and stronger than me, and we're alone. We haven't passed anyone else for ages. If you wanted to hurt me, it would be easy, and you could do it before anyone could get here to stop you." "Gee, you don't have to take everything so seriously." Parthenia tutted, even more annoyed. "You don't understand, and I think you don't want to either." She about-faced and began to walk away. "It's the Duchess," he called out to her back. "I was taking you to the Duchess. I thought it would be cool to hang out there. The ship's deserted. No one goes there anymore. We would have it to ourselves." Parthenia carried on walking. She heard running footsteps, and Camille touched her shoulder. "I'm sorry. That was dumb of me to make a big thing of not telling you where we were going. I didn't mean to spook you." She halted. "Thanks for apologizing. I guess you don't understand where I was coming from. It isn't easy to imagine what life is like for me." "Why don't you come with me and explain? I would never hurt you, Parthenia. I'm shocked you would even think that." His gaze was so serious and sincere, she relented and took his hand again. They began to retrace their former route. "It's nothing personal, Camille. I have to be like this with everyone. I always have to be extra careful, and that's never going to change, unless perhaps we make it to Earth. Things might be different there." They passed into the silent, deep sleep chamber. The empty capsules, like open, transparent eggs, rose in ranks to the high ceiling, shadowy in the low emergency lighting. She gave a slight shudder. "Creepy, right?" said Camille. "It's hard to imagine we spent decades in those things, and that everyone we left behind is probably dead." "You're really great at showing a girl a good time, you know that?" He laughed and grabbed her shoulder, giving her a sideways hug. "That's me. Here we are." The Duchess's airlock yawned before them, black and foreboding. "I'm not sure this is such a good idea." "Don't worry, I have a few magic tricks of my own." He stepped into the darkness, and suddenly the ship's lights blinked on. "She still has power?" "Running on auxiliary, like the Bathsheba, I expect." "But I thought her engines were shot away." "Her engines, not her emergency fuel tank. Come on, let's explore." He took her hand again. "Okay, but I'm even more familiar with the Duchess than I am with the Bathsheba." She recalled the long months she'd spent in cramped conditions aboard the Merc ship. "It's not the same when there's no one else about." They walked through the narrower passage of the smaller starship until they reached the bridge. He was right. The ship looked and felt different now they were the only ones aboard. The space looked bigger than she remembered it, and it had an eerie, forgotten air. "I wonder how many battles were fought from here?" asked Camille. "Lots, I imagine. Carina would know about some of them. But the black dogs were in existence for years before she joined." He sat in the captain's chair and beckoned her over. When she joined him, he moved to one side and pulled her by the waist, encouraging her to squeeze in next to him. Wrapping an arm around her, he asked, "Do you think you'll ever captain a starship one day?" "Me? No. I'm not interested in anything like that." "What are you interested in?" Surviving and living in safety would be nice." "That doesn't seem a lot to ask. You don't have any higher ambitions?" She sighed. "You asked me to explain why I was so cautious about going somewhere alone with you just now. It's because I'm a mage. That carries baggage you don't understand." She went on to tell him about her early life, growing up in her father's mansion on Ithia, and what her mother's life was like, though she didn't go into much detail about that. Then she told him how Carina had helped them all to escape, and what the family had endured until her sister had hired the black dogs. "You see, Carina isn't doing all of this because she has some wild romantic notion about Earth. For us, as mages, reaching it could mean the difference between life and death, between freedom and slavery and torture. You might think it would be great to be able to do what we do, but our lives would be a lot safer if we couldn't cast, if we lived like regular human beings." "So when I wouldn't tell you where I was taking you, you thought I might be kidnapping you?" "It wouldn't be the first time. Carina had kept her ability secret all her life until she met Bryce. She never trusted anyone." "And you don't trust me?" A guilty ache settled on her stomach. "Don't ask me that. It isn't fair." "You're right." He apologized for the second time. In the ensuing pause, Parthenia thought back to the time she'd spent on the Duchess, and the Zenobia, and before that, the Nightfall. So much had happened since departing the Shura mansion, where her life had been tranquil on the surface, though turbulent and bitter underneath. She was tired of the endless travelling, fighting and danger, and she yearned for actual tranquility and peace, not the facsimile her father had tried to create. "I brought you here for another reason," said Camille. "I mean, as well as to spend time alone with you on a ghost ship." "Ghost ship?" She looked around the bridge once more. The place did have an eerie vibe. Thanks for that. Don't worry, I'll protect you from any ghouls or zombies that come our way. In the meantime, I'll tell you my idea. He removed his arm from her shoulders in order to turn sideways and face her. You know, when your sister was telling us about the planets we could visit to refuel, did you have a preference? No, I didn't think about it, to be honest. I have no idea which of them would be best. I've a feeling she'll pick Magog. It has a big population and a thriving interstellar trade system, so the Bathsheba is less likely to stand out and attract attention. And with so many people living there, we're likely to be able to buy whatever we want. Okay, but does it matter? We probably won't even leave the ship. We might, if we want to. He looked her directly in the eyes. I have a suggestion. What do you think about disembarking, leaving the Bathsheba, and not continuing to Earth? Huh? She sat upright and stared at him. We barely survived the encounter with the Regians, and it's a long way between here and the end of the voyage. Who knows what else might happen? We might be attacked again, or the ship could suffer a malfunction and we drift to our deaths in the depths of galactic space. He put a hand on her arm. If we stayed on a planet around here, we could make a life together. I hear what you say about the dangers of living as a mage, but if you never do any of those special things you can do, how would anyone know you're different? Don't you think it's safer to live like that than go with your sister across the stars to an unknown future? When I signed up to the Black Dogs, I was excited to go on adventures, but I've had my fill of them. And I found you. We get along pretty well, I'd say. And there's no reason things won't get more serious between us over time. She didn't know what to say. Camille had thrust his ideas upon her one after another, not giving her time to absorb one before he was on to the next. Disembark the Bathsheba permanently? Leave behind her family? Give up on safely living as a mage on Earth? Appearing to see her confusion, Camille said, You don't have to give me your answer now. We have plenty of time before they set a course for Earth. Think about what I said. When we find out where we're going, we'll have a better idea if what I'm proposing makes sense. Maybe I'm being an idiot, I don't know. But it's worth thinking about, right? Remaining nonplussed, she could only nod. Chapter 12. Carina's decision on which planet they would refuel at had been made, and most other things in her life were going very well indeed. She had slumbered deeply, as though cocooned within a thick, soft blanket of contentment. She was slowly wakening, vaguely aware she should move and rouse herself, but she was fighting it, clinging on for a few more moments of blissful serenity. A thudding sound broke into the edges of her consciousness. Was it the beating of Bryce's heart where his chest pressed against her back? No, the thudding was too fast, too urgent. Was it one of the kids banging on the door, wanting to speak to her? Perhaps it was Darius or Nala, frightened by a nightmare and needing some comfort. She forced an eye open and saw the darkened bedroom of her new quarters. A light was blinking on the comm panel next to her bed, and from her earcom on the bedside table she could hear the tiny ding of a new message notification. The thudding noise started up again, resonant and angry. A sense of alarm filtered into her groggy mind. Whoever was hitting the door was strong enough to make a noise through the thick material, designed to suppress external sounds. "Stars, what's that noise?" murmured Bryce. He rolled onto his back, smacking dry lips and withdrawing the arm that had been wrapped around her, allowing her to slide to the edge of the bed and reach for the wall comm. She swiped it, and Vazia Rebane materialized on the screen. He looked livid with anger.
I know you're in there, Lin. Open up. You can't avoid me forever.
Bryce peered over her shoulder and rolled away again, groaning.
It's way too early to see that face.
She closed the connection and turned to give him a look.
He could hear me, right?
She rolled her eyes and opened the comm again. Sorry, Rebane. I was asleep and didn't hear the door chime. Give me a minute, okay? The man looked fit to burst a blood vessel as he opened his mouth to reply, but she swiped the screen and his face disappeared. Still reluctant to emerge from peaceful oblivion, she pushed down the covers and sat up. She rubbed away the sleep that had gathered at the corners of her eyes and then reached for her robe. As she stretched out, Bryce caressed her back, and the sensation brought evocative memories of the previous few nights. She leaned down to kiss him, but it was just a quick peck on the lips. Anything longer, and she might be tempted to keep Rebane waiting a long time. Nevertheless, Bryce's hands wandered over her, and it was an effort to move away, swing her legs off the bed and stand up, pulling on the robe and fastening the tie. She padded across the living area to the door and opened it a fraction. I know why you're here, she said quickly, before Rebane could launch into the tirade lurking behind his furious visage. I'll meet you in the captain's office in 15 minutes.
No, we have waited long enough.
At his mention of we, Carina noticed 10 or more of Mezban's soldiers hovering in the passageway directly behind him.
We demand that you release Papu immediately, Rebane continued, adding as his volume dipped and he leaned in and glared. Or we will release him ourselves.
You aren't in a position to demand anything. As I said before, all of Mezban's former soldiers are here at my invitation, and that invitation can be revoked at any moment. We're nearing habitable zones, so if you want to remain in service aboard this ship, I would think about that if I were you. Meet me at the captain's office in 15 minutes, if you still wish to discuss Papu's situation. Her gaze not leaving Rebane's, she closed the door. When he could no longer see her, however, her defiant attitude withered, and she trudged back to her bed. I've been preoccupied with deciding where we should go to refuel. I'd forgotten about Rebane and his demand. I guess I'd better get ready and go and talk to him. Bryce was still lying down, his hands behind his head.
Come over here.
I don't know if that's wise, she replied, though she obeyed. When she reached him, he grabbed her waist and pulled her down and under him before kissing her softly and deeply. She could have lain here and been kissed by Bryce all day if she'd had the choice, but she didn't. She gently pushed his chest to create a little distance.
What are you going to say to him?
He asked, his face hanging over hers. I hadn't gotten that far yet. All I know is I can't let Papu out. He can do a lot of damage when he's riled, but I'm not sure how Rebane's going to react when I tell him. Things could get nasty.
Then don't tell him.
Say, His gaze shifted away and then returned.
Say you have the matter under consideration, or some other bullshit.
I'd love to, but I don't think it's going to work. You saw how he is. He looked like he wanted to rip my head off. Bryce gently grasped her head.
No, he can't do that. I like it too much.
She exhaled deeply and looked into his eyes. Their new intimacy was double-edged. She loved their physical closeness, which had opened up whole new areas of each other to explore, but she also felt uncertain and vulnerable, as well as the anxiety induced by revealing herself to a non-mage, brought on by the warnings Nine-Eye had drilled into her with rigid discipline throughout her childhood. She was also consumed by the fear that, if something were to happen to him, it might destroy her. She didn't know if she would still be capable of protecting her family. Her relationship with him was stronger than ever, but somehow it made her weaker. How Ma must have suffered when Stefan Scherer killed her father. How had she managed to carry on?
Do you want me to come with you to talk to him?
Carina dragged herself back to her present predicament. No, it's okay. Unwillingly, she eased out from under him. I'll get dressed. If I'm late, Rebane might just explode, or worse, attack the brig with his buddies.
Do you really think he'd do that?
Yes, and that's something I didn't forget about. After he and his cronies left the meeting the other day, I tripled the guard on the brig. If Mezban's soldiers do decide to take matters into their own hands, the guards should have time to get the word out to the rest of the black dogs before they're overwhelmed. She got up, grabbed her ear comm and padded into the bathroom, popping in her comm as she went. Rebane had left her 31 messages. She told her comm to erase them before playing the others. The kids had left her a few silly messages that made her smile, and Oriana had asked her and Bryce to join them for breakfast. She would have to leave that to him. While she was in the shower, she recalled his offer to help her with Rebane. His intentions were kind, but she wasn't sure his presence would do any good. However, the thought sparked an idea of someone else who might be useful to have on hand. Someone much more experienced than either of them, whose opinion and advice Cadwallader had valued highly. She messaged him, and after quickly explaining her problem, asked if he would join her at the meeting. Chapter 13. When she entered the captain's office, Jace was already waiting, along with Rebane. The latter had come along without his entourage of fellow soldiers, she was relieved to note. Jace and Rebane were chatting, but they stopped as she walked in. The apparent congeniality between the two men was surprising. Rebane appeared relaxed, even cheerful. He stiffened at the sight of her, however, and his eyes narrowed with what looked like suspicion or enmity.
"Carina,"
said Jace.
"Thanks for inviting me. I've been talking to Vazia about his home world. It's been very interesting."
The man's expression softened again. She looked from one to the other before replying as she sat down. "I'm glad to have you here." Placing her elbows on the table, she continued, "I'll come straight to the point."
"Before we get to the reason for the meeting," said Jace, "do you mind if Vazia finishes what he was telling me? It'll only take a minute."
Nonplussed, she replied, "Sure, go ahead." The man in question hesitated, then said,
"I was explaining about a global annual festival we hold on Lotakrilla. In ancient times, it celebrated the return of a migratory animal my ancestors relied upon for food. Now the festival is purely ritual, naturally. So the practice you mentioned doesn't involve live animals?"
Jace asked. Rebane smiled and gave a slight shake of his head.
"Archaeologists have found great pits filled with bones from the times when a great slaughter and feast would take place. But these days, parents make large models of the beasts and the children break them open the morning of the celebration." "That sounds like a lot of fun," Jace said. "Don't you think so, Carina?"
Yeah."
"And what do the parents do to celebrate?"
Rebane smiled even wider, bearing 2 even rows of large white teeth and reminding her of the recently deceased Lomang.
"What do you think? We get drunk, of course."
Jace laughed heartily and slapped the man on his back.
"I like the sound of this festival more and more."
She managed something she hoped resembled a cheerful face, though she was completely confused. Firstly, in all the time she'd known him, she had never seen Jace take even a sip of an alcoholic drink, so she had no idea why he was faking camaraderie with Rebane. And secondly, she didn't understand what any of this had to do with Papu. Before she could return to the subject at hand, Jace asked Rebane,
"Do your people have any other customs?"
He pondered before answering,
"Nothing universal springs to mind. Lotokrilla has been settled many thousands of years, and our nations have developed discrete identities and customs.
He raised a finger.
Except for this."
He stroked his highly styled beard.
"In all the other worlds I've visited, I haven't seen any men wearing their beards as we do. Yours is impressive, but I don't mean to be rude. It's quite untamed. On my home planet, men take great care over their facial hair. A man would never be seen in public with an ungroomed beard, so I guess you could call that another Lotokrillan custom."
"Lomang was clean-shaven," said Carina. "How come?" Jace glanced at her, seeming to approve of the question.
"Lomang belonged to the ruling class," replied Rebane. "The practices of ordinary people didn't apply to him."
"Right, I get it."
"And Papu?"
Jace asked gently.
"As Lomang's brother, he must belong to the ruling class too. Is that why you would like him to be released?"
A flame of anger flickered in Rebane's face, but it was quickly replaced by resignation.
"Papu is, I'm not sure how to say it, simple. His thinking is not the same as regular people. He must be told what to do. Now that Lomang is dead, Papu is no longer dangerous."
He addressed his last remark to Carina in a pleading tone. Now that he'd lost his aggressive, abrasive attitude, and in light of what he'd told her about Papu, she felt a little more disposed to letting the man go free. But she hadn't made up her mind yet. "You must know you're asking a lot. Papu nearly killed me, twice. He's a walking lethal weapon, and if what you say is true, a single command from someone he respects could result in murder." Rebane deflated a little.
"I don't think he's ever been alone before. He needs company."
She recalled the giant sitting at the feet of his brother, listening to Lomang's endless drivel and self-aggrandizing. She also recalled his childlike fear of Mezban, despite his huge size. What Rebane said made sense. Yet the notion of Papu walking around the ship unrestrained filled her with apprehension. "I'm not going to give the order for his immediate release, but I am going to think about what you've told me. And in the meantime, I'll look into ways to make his incarceration more bearable." Rebane spread his hands wide and said,
"That's all we were ever asking."
He rose to his feet and bowed. Jace said,
"We should meet up sometime, and I'll tell you about Ostalon." "I would like that,"
Rebane replied, and then left. She leaned back in her seat to watch him until he'd gone some way down the passage. "That isn't all they were ever asking," she whispered. "You were there too, right? You saw how they behaved."
"You have a positive outcome, but you're still complaining?"
She frowned, frustrated, though she wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was because she didn't understand the transformation Rebane had undergone between leaving her cabin and arriving at the captain's office. Appearing to sense her bewilderment, Jace continued,
"Mezban's men have lost their leader, and they're far from home. They have no history at all with you or the Black Dogs, and so they must feel insecure in their status on the ship. I think Papu is more than an incarcerated man to them. He represents something, their identity perhaps, hence their desire to see him released. It's symbolic in a way." Her frown deepened. Papu represented Mezban soldiers' identity? What the hell did that mean? Jace grinned. "I think Vazia just wanted to be heard, you know."
"Okay." She set aside her confusion. "Whatever. As long as he's happy for now and we can move ahead with the important stuff. Thanks for coming. You were a big help."
"You're welcome, any time."
She resolved to honour her promise to Rebane to look into improving Papu's day-to-day life, but she wouldn't be reducing his guard, despite her new knowledge of his mental status. She might even increase it. If he was so easily controlled, what might he do under the instruction of someone like Rebane, who had anger management problems?
"By the way, have you come to a decision about where we're going?"
"Yes, Magog." Chapter 14. They had to fly the star whale to the Cloud City. Carina wasn't happy about it, but they had no choice. Trying to land the Bathsheba on Magog was out of the question. The vessel simply wasn't built for landing anywhere, let alone withstanding the effects of passage through an atmosphere. And even if they did manage to get her down in one piece, the notion of the ship escaping planetary gravity was ludicrous. Somewhere in the Bathsheba's long history, the shuttlecraft that had ferried her passengers to their new world had been permanently parted from the ship, and the Peregrine's and the Duchess's fuel tanks were empty. The Regians had been thorough in exacting their revenge, so if they were to visit Magog, it had to be aboard the Star Whale. Yet landing a living space creature at one of the planet's spaceports would attract a lot of unwanted attention. Carina feared it would be like hanging out a massive sign with an arrow pointing downward and saying, "The colony ship owners are right here." Once a galactic sector had been explored and colonized, no one invested in the building of the vast vessels anymore. Local authorities and non-governmental skywatchers might have already spotted the rare and extremely valuable relic of a former age in their system. Eventually someone would find the temptation to try to seize the ship too great to resist, and Carina and her companions would become targets. Her plan was to smoothly navigate Magog's immigration and customs, arrange a delivery of the much-needed fuel, perhaps pick up a few desirable items like printer supplies and the chemicals for the stasis chamber fluid, and then get off-planet as quickly as possible. Xiao had come along, leaving her new apprentice, the black dog called Bibic, at the helm of the Bathsheba, though due to the situation his position was honorary only. Carina had invited the pilot in case there was an opportunity to buy a large shuttle, which would come in handy when they reached Earth. Darius was also aboard, much to her regret. She hated subjecting her young brother to the risks of the visit, but he was the only one who could talk to the star whale. He had named her Poppy. Vigo Justice was here too. She valued any input the man might have on the people of Magog, the rules and regulations, and their local culture. She figured local knowledge would help in business dealings. Another reason for including the man was to appease Rebane and the rest of the Lotta Krillans. She had thought about what Jace had said regarding their sense of identity, and though she thought the whole idea was pretty airy-fairy, she hoped her decision would make them feel represented. For some reason, Parthenia had insisted on accompanying the party too, along with Camille. Carina wasn't sure why, except perhaps, like most everyone aboard the Bathsheba, her sister was desperate to set foot on a warm, green, friendly world. Without any concrete objection to offer, and knowing Parthenia's thirst for independence and self-determination, Carina had agreed. She was sitting in the space behind one of Poppy's transparent apertures, watching the approach to Magog as she mentally went over the Star Whale's passenger list, when Xiao suddenly appeared. "Mind if I join you?" "Sure." Carina shuffled sideways, making room for the pilot. "Whoa!" said Xiao as she entered the space and caught sight of the vista beyond the Star Whale's visual organ. Carina knew what she meant. Poppy had already dipped so low, the black of space was only visible at the extremities of the view. A sea of cloud made up the remainder, interspersed with flashes of brilliant emerald green from the planet's surface. Among the clouds, though they were difficult to spot due to the distance, the tall spires of shiny white constructions poked up. Carina supposed the constructions were supported somehow, but they appeared to float independently, disappearing and reappearing as clouds washed over them like waves across an exposed reef. "I've never visited a cloud city before," said Xiao. "Have you?" Carina frowned, casting her mind back over her time as a merc, when she'd made planetfall on many worlds. She replied, giving a small shake of her head. "I don't think so. I think I would have remembered something like this." She jerked her chin at Magog. There was no denying the place was stunning, but, like every planet, it would hold secrets and dangers. She was about to ask the pilot what suggestions she had for landing Poppy at the spaceport, but Xiao held up a hand and put the other to her ear. "Did you get that?" she asked after a few moments of listening. "No, what was it?" "Your comms still fixed at shipboard frequency. You need to switch it to galactic. The nearest spaceport just contacted us, a place called Japheth. Do you want me to respond and go through the protocols?" "Sure. Tell them our ship is the Poppy out of Ithia." Xiao nodded. "They won't have heard of Ithia, but we have to give them a name." She began a murmured conversation with Japheth Space Traffic Control. At one point she chuckled and said, "Yes, she certainly is." Carina guessed the traffic control officer had remarked upon their unusual vessel. Xiao turned to her and said, "All done. We're cleared to land. Should I talk to Darius about where Poppy has to go?" "Yeah. Good luck," she added as the pilot climbed out. Xiao would have to convey the landing instructions to a 7-year-old, who would then send them to an alien space creature, who would then have to somehow comply with them, despite the unfamiliarity of the situation. Had Poppy ever landed at a spaceport? The Regians had raided settlements on undeveloped planets, and had probably never even attempted to land a ship at a regular port. She hoped their living ship would understand what to do, and she wouldn't come to any harm. The Magog immigration officer's expression was stern as Carina approached her station at Japheth Spaceport. A transparent barrier divided her from the tall blonde woman, whose eyes were blue like Cadwallader's. "Your party has no documentation," said the officer. "Are you its representative?" "I am. We're from Out Sector." The woman's eyebrows lifted a fraction. "Out Sector?" She lowered her gaze to the screen. "Name?" "Carina Lin." She had contemplated assuming a fake name, but she couldn't imagine her notoriety would have spread as far as the edge of Gerial Sector, and using false names during the visit could attract attention if they got them wrong. She glanced over her shoulder at Xiao, Justus, Darius, Parthenia, Camille, and Halliday, who stood in a roughly assembled group the mandated distance of 3 meters behind. She had told the mercs to wear mufti and come unarmed. All were watching the proceedings uneasily. If they were turned away at Japheth Spaceport, it was unlikely they would be allowed in at any other on Magog. They would either have to attempt a clandestine landing and take the risk of operating illegally on the planet, or try their luck at Gog. "What's your reason for visiting Magog?" the officer asked. "Business." The woman lifted her gaze and glared. "I'm going to need more than that." "I'm here to buy starship fuel." "Really?" The corner of her lip lifted sardonically. "I heard about the ship you arrived on. I'm sure someone has some hay or oats to sell you." "What?" Carina looked over her shoulder again, wondering if the others could shed some light on what the officer meant, but they appeared as confused as her. The immigration officer chuckled at her own joke before turning serious again. "Every member of your party must submit full biodata." That's fine. You first. A screen next to the officer's booth slid sideways, revealing a narrow entrance. After a third and final glance at her companions, Carina stepped into the stall. The door slid shut. A screen faced her, and above and below, tiny lenses scrutinized her from every angle. She followed the automated instructions, allowing the machine to take her fingerprints and retinal and breath signatures. Then a slot opened and a small metal tray holding a plastic cup slid out. Words on the screen instructed her to spit. Shit! There could be only one reason the Magog authorities wanted her saliva. The biodata they collected from visitors included DNA. She had never knowingly given up her DNA. It was yet another of the prohibitions involved in being a mage. Her abilities were almost certainly encoded in her genes, and allowing a third-party access to that information would put her in jeopardy. A window jerked open, and the immigration officer scowled through it. "Is there a problem?" "No, my mouth's dry, that's all. Long flight. I'm working on it." "Do that. I don't have all day." The window slammed shut. She continued to hesitate. If she didn't spit in the cup, she would be refused entry at the very least. But she was more likely to trigger suspicion she was a criminal. She would be detained for who knew how long, and her party would be split up. It would be a disaster. Darius was the only one who could send to Poppy to get everyone off planet. She couldn't even change her mind about visiting Magog and try to leave. That would look just as suspicious. She was trapped. Misgivings weighing her down, she leaned forward and spat. The metal tray slid out of sight and the slot closed. At the same time, the door behind her opened. "You have 3 days on Magog," said the immigration officer. Only 3 days? Would that be enough time? She wasn't sure. "A Magog day is 6 hours galactic," added the woman. 18 hours? But that isn't— "Wait for your party over there." The officer jabbed her thumb, indicating a spot behind her booth. "I need to help my brother. He's only 7. His instructions will be child-friendly. Wait over there." Did Parthenia and Darius know they weren't supposed to give up their DNA? Had Ma told them? If she had, would they refuse to spit and create a ruckus? She couldn't speak to them before they passed through the immigration screening. Turning to face her companions, she mouthed, "It's okay," and gave them a double thumbs up. It was the best she could do. Chapter 15. Stepping through the exit to Japheth Spaceport, Parthenia blinked in the sunlight, but it was more than sunlight that was hurting her eyes. A sea of blinding white surrounded her. The only exception to the colour was a pale grey ribbon of road that ran across the exit, disappearing at its extremities into thin vaporous cloud. A delicate mist wreathed her feet and rendered everything at ground level more than a few meters away indistinct. In the distance, glossy white buildings rose out of the cloud, some squat, square and flat-roofed, while others were taller and culminated in spires, either slim and straight, narrowing to needle points, or tightly twisted and topped by flat platforms.
"Oh,"
breathed Darius, covering his hands with both eyes. "I guess that's what these are for," Xiao said as she lifted her sunglasses. Everyone in the group had been handed a pair just before leaving the spaceport. "Yes," said Parthenia. "Put your glasses on, Darius." "I feel light," the little boy commented as he followed her advice. "That's because the gravity is lower here than on the Bathsheba." Parthenia slipped her sunglasses on. The scene dimmed, easing the pain in her eyes, and became more sharply defined. Where the white of the buildings had caused them to appear melded into the clouds, they stood out clearly now. She could see a wide conglomeration of the structures that she guessed indicated the site of the main city. It was hard to tell how far away it was. Her sense of perspective was confused by the lack of landmarks. The air was chilly and humid, but it also smelled fresh and clean and very unlike the stale, recycled atmosphere aboard the Bathsheba. She breathed deeply, but then shivered slightly and rubbed her upper arms. Carina was already walking toward the roadside, looking from side to side. More new arrivals were flooding from the spaceport exit, pushing past her to line up at a sign. The screen bore a message in 3 scripts. Parthenia could only read the one at the top, which said, "Free transport to Japheth." Camille, who was standing at her side, gave her a sideways hug and said quietly in her ear, "What do you think so far?" "We've only just arrived. We don't know anything about the place yet." He released his clasp on her shoulder, straightened up and said, "I think it looks spectacular. Must be amazing to live here." Alarmed at his comment, spoken at normal volume, Parthenia looked with concern to her sister. But Carina didn't seem to have heard him. Camille was rushing ahead with his idea of the 2 of them abandoning the voyage to Earth and settling on Magog in a way that made her extremely uncomfortable. She resolved to speak to him frankly when they had a moment alone together. "I guess we wait here," said Carina, indicating the line next to the sign, which was already long. "I'd prefer to hire a car, but we don't have any currency. We only have the gems, and I'm not giving one of those over for a ride into town." "Is there a problem with taking the bus?" asked Xiao. "We're only allowed 18 hours until we have to leave. I wanted to save time." 18 hours isn't long," said Justus. "You're telling me," Carina said, moving to the back of the line and gesturing for the rest of the group to join her. "We'll just have to do what we can. If we can find the vendors we need, maybe we can conclude negotiations from orbit. I don't want to overstay and attract attention from the authorities." "Especially not now they have our DNA," Parthenia thought as she walked to the line. Mother had always disposed of her and her siblings' hair and nail clippings carefully, and warned them to do the same if they were ever outside the family home. Giving the Magog immigration office a sample of her saliva had felt very wrong, even though Carina had said it was okay. Minutes later, an autobus arrived. 3 decks high and slim, the vehicle glided just above the surface of the road. She recalled the vehicles on Ostalon had operated in the same manner, without wheels. The Magogians were high-tech. There shouldn't be too much trouble buying fuel for the Bathsheba. The line moved forward as the people in the front climbed aboard the autobus. Before long, the bus was full, though some people remained waiting. The doors closed automatically and it sped away, driverless. The number waiting for transportation had decreased to the group from the Bathsheba and 10 or 12 others, who seemed to be 2 families. The children of the families sneaked glances over their shoulders at Parthenia and her companions, somehow able to tell they were different from regular visitors. She looked down at her clothes, which, she had to admit, was scruffy, though clean. Everything she had packed for the trip was similar. She didn't possess any better clothes. There didn't seem much point in dressing up aboard the ship, where no formal events took place and you saw the same people day in and day out. Oriana and Fern entertained themselves with fashion design, but that was only to help pass the time. After the mages had done their meditation for the day, they had to find ways to entertain themselves. She looked more closely at the attire of the Magogians and saw it was rich and expensive, reminding her of the clothes in the closets aboard Lomang's ship, the Zenobia. Threads made from precious metals were woven into the fabrics, giving them additional luster in the bright sunlight. None of her party was dressed in a style befitting the elite status of the inhabitants of the Cloud City. and suddenly her cheeks turned hot with shame, though she knew it was an instinctive reaction born of years of her father's domineering obsession with appearances and flaunting his wealth. She couldn't help her feelings. She yearned to disappear into the ground, except here that would probably entail falling hundreds of meters to her death. Camille leaned in close and whispered, "Is something wrong?"
"It's nothing, but we aren't dressed for this."
A Magogian child's wide-eyed gaze was fixed on her as she spoke. The child's mother noticed and jerked the boy's hand, causing him to turn his face forward. "Yeah, I see what you mean," said Camille. "We're gonna stick out like bog fireballs."
"Like what?"
"Fireballs in marshland. You get them when the methane catches light. You can't really see them during the day, but at night they shine out like lamps. They're blue. Quite pretty, actually."
"Well, I don't think it's going to help our cause to be so noticeable."
"It's unavoidable when you go to a new world. Different places have different styles, food, customs. Hell, people even smell different. The locals can tell tourists from a click away."
"Here comes another one!"
Darius yelled excitedly as another transport emerged from the mist and glided along the roadway. "Come on, little fella," said Halliday as the vehicle drew to a stop. "I'll help you up." The merc bent down to pick up Darius, but the boy protested,
"I can do it myself."
Halliday raised his eyebrows and chuckled. "I'll take your bag then." He picked up Darius's small hold-all and moved out of the way to allow him to step up onto the bus. Parthenia noticed Carina's deeply worried expression as her sister also climbed aboard. It was hardly surprising. They had to find a starship fuel vendor and negotiate the purchase and delivery of the fuel in a very short period of time. Their task was fraught with danger. Carina would be paying for the fuel with one or more of the ember gems. What if the stones were unknown in this region of Gerial sector and held no value? Or worse still, what if their value was known, but an unscrupulous merchant decided to simply steal the gems? As off-planet visitors, would they have any recourse to justice? Parthenia was the last to board. Camille held out a hand to help her up, though she didn't really need it. His face was a total contrast to Carina's. He looked happy and hopeful, as if he were about to embark on a new, exciting adventure. A sense of shadowy foreboding settled on her. She faced a big decision, and whichever choice she made, she was going to hurt someone. Chapter 16. As Carina travelled aboard the autobus from Japheth Spaceport into the city, she was reminded of her ride to Langley Dirkson's mansion on Ostalon after Commander Key had captured her aboard the Shura shuttle. The vehicle maintained the same smooth A-grav motion. Magog was clearly an advanced world, but on Ostalon that had been due to the Dirksons' exploitation of the rest of the population. She didn't doubt the same was true here, that the elite took advantage of the poorer sections of society. She took off her sunglasses, turned in her seat, hanging her elbow over the back, and said to Justus, "You said your father used to trade for animal skins and seeds here. Can you remember anything else he said about the planet?" "I've been racking my brains. I want to help if I can, but I haven't spoken to my father in years. Those things he told you were from when I was at high school. The old man loved to bend my ear about his voyages when he got home. I'm sorry to say I never listened closely. I used to find his stories boring. You know what teenagers are like. The only other comment I remember him making is that he could never seem to make a good deal here. He always came away barely breaking even. I think after a few tries, he gave up and never came back. That doesn't bode well for us. If I can find someone to sell us some fuel, I might just have to pay whatever price they ask." She faced forward and watched the shifting cloud scenery and approaching buildings as the autobus skimmed the road to Japheth City. Xiao, who was sitting ahead on the left-hand side of the autobus, began talking to one of the locals, a skinny man with protruding cheekbones, dressed in a formal pale blue suit, the jacket ending at his knees. The pilot asked him about the infrastructure supporting the city in the air. It's quite a complex system, but basically most of what you see floats upon helium balloons. In order to maintain a steady height, gas is added or released to counteract fluctuations in local air pressure and currents. There's also a degree of flexibility in every structure up here to allow for movement. To keep the city in one place, giant tethers run from the base to the ground below.
I was about to ask about that, said Xiao. So there's no way of moving it, or parts of it, to another place? I was thinking that propellers or jet engines could move places like this quite easily.
Carina smiled, imagining the pilot must be fantasizing about flying an entire metropolis. I believe in the early days of the cloud cities, hundreds of years ago, some attempts were made, the man replied. But the stress on the constructions was too great. A number of tragic accidents occurred. Nowadays, attempting to move a cloud city is illegal. Xiao looked disappointed. The road suddenly dipped and the surrounding cloud disappeared. They were travelling along a street bordered by villas. Flat green lawns ran from the road to the houses. Most had steps leading up to a veranda overhung by a pitched tile roof. On the driveway sat torpedo-shaped vehicles, their rounded wheelless bases resting directly on the ground. The bus slowed and halted, and the man in the blue suit alighted with his wife and kids. The locals had some way of calming the vehicle to tell it to stop. The family was the last of the Magogians to depart. Now the bus only contained the group from the Bathsheba. As neither Carina nor any of her companions had access to the vehicle's system, they would have to wait until the bus reached the end of its route. It arrived sooner than she'd thought. The autobus veered sharp left and glided downward, following a new road that ended in the large, dark mouth of a tunnel. Before she even had a chance to decide whether they really wanted to go that way, they'd entered the tunnel. Lights on the walls scudded past.
"Where are we going?"
asked Darius. She didn't reply, but leaned forward anxiously. The bus was speeding up. Why was it doing that? Maybe they should have gotten off the last time it stopped. The local man hadn't said anything, but there could be all kinds of reasons why. A sudden burst of light nearly blinded her, and the bus braked and halted. The vehicle had emerged into a wide plaza, open to the sky. Shops and cafes ringed the space, which was bustling with pedestrians. She put on her sunglasses. This must be the end of the line. She slid out of her seat, lifted her bag onto her shoulder, and went to the exit. The group climbed down from the bus and out into brilliant sunlight and the noise of the crowd. They were standing on a sidewalk several meters wide, running around the inner circumference of a circular, one-story open-air mall. The now empty bus pulled away and slipped seamlessly into the flow of vehicles speeding past. The cars were similar to the ones Carina had seen before, Agrav tube-shaped and flawless. They stopped to drop off and pick up shoppers at the curbside before zooming off, clearly controlled by an autonomous traffic system. The central area beyond the road appeared to lack a floor. Hazy cloud billowed up, obscuring the view of whatever lay beneath. "Where to now?" Halliday asked. The merc was still carrying Darius's bag for him. She didn't know. People were flowing around them like a river around rocks. The Magogians chattered, laughed, gossiped, and exclaimed, all seeming happy and in high spirits. They also appeared to be in a hurry. She wondered why, until she remembered that a day and a night on Magog only lasted 6 galactic hours.
That probably didn't allow much time for shopping or leisure activities. She looked up and saw that the sun had already moved a significant distance across the sky during their short journey from the spaceport. "Let's go over there," she said, noticing a spot that didn't look quite so busy. She pointed toward it and forced a passage through the crowd, fighting against the current of bodies. When she reached the area, the reason for its comparative emptiness became clear. A silver plaque stood there at a 90-degree angle, surrounded by low railings. Names were inscribed on the plaque below the title, Mayors of Japheth. Unless they stepped over the railings, which probably wasn't allowed, the space was just as crowded as everywhere else. She checked that other members of her party had caught up. They clustered, buffeted by passing pedestrians. She felt like screaming in frustration. This was impossible. They had no local money or any means of getting any, and without creds they were cut off from the networks that would allow her to find a starship fuel vendor. Time was also quickly running out. How long had they been here already? An hour? The sun would set soon, and they had nowhere to stay, though perhaps that wouldn't be too much of a problem. She assumed Magogian's physical needs were basically like other humans, and they slept roughly 8 hours out of 24. That had to mean everything didn't shut down at night.
"Carina,"
said Darius, tugging on her sleeve. "Yes, sweetheart."
"I need to pee."
She let out a sigh of exasperation, then rubbed his hair affectionately. "Okay, let's find a cafe. I'm sure they'll let you use their restroom." She scanned around. "I can see one," Parthenia said. After another fight through the crowd, they arrived outside an eating establishment. Small tables and seats dotted the area in front of the door, and each place was filled. The people sipped drinks and leaned close to hear each other above the hubbub. As she approached with her companions, an almost comical sweep of heads turned in their direction. After briefly checking out the newcomers, the cafe's patrons returned to their conversations. She took Darius by the hand, told the others to wait for her, and stepped through the entrance. Inside, the noise of the street faded a little, and the bright glare of the sun was filtered by something in the glass of the windows. Though the material was entirely clear, the light level was dramatically decreased. The Magogian customers reacted to Carina and Darius's arrival in the same way as their outdoor counterparts. The conversation instantly dropped to silence, but then resumed so quickly she was left wondering if she'd imagined the interval. Smartly dressed men and women were crushed into the confines of the space, leaving only a narrow trail through the tables to the service counter. Only the cafe's human server was paying her any attention, though she had the impression that everyone else was studiously avoiding looking at her and her brother. She navigated the room, Darius trailing, until she arrived at the counter. "Welcome," said the server, a young woman wearing neat black overalls. Like the immigration official, she was blue-eyed and blonde. An aura of frizzy hair bushed out all around her head. Her gaze flicked to Carina's feet and returned to her eyes. "We're a little busy right now, but if you'd like..." "We actually don't want a table. My brother needs to go to the bathroom. Is it okay if he uses yours?" "Oh, sure. Help yourselves. It's right through there." She indicated farther into the cafe with a nod of her head. "Darius," said Carina, "can you manage to find it by yourself?"
"Uh-huh,"
he replied, trotting away with some haste. "This is probably going to sound weird," she said to the server, "but I'm looking for somewhere I can buy fuel for a colony starship. Can you help me?" "Starship fuel?" The woman laughed. "I get some pretty strange requests in this job, but that one tops the lot. Maybe you could look up suppliers on your local network. You see, I just arrived and..." Her attention had been drawn by something happening outside the cafe. A few of the locals were talking to her companions. They were not regular shoppers, however. They looked like officials of some kind. Parthenia and Justus were talking to them. Her alarm bells went off. What were her sister and the Lotokrillon man telling the Magogians? They weren't doing anything illegal, but considering their group contained 3 mages, they had to be extremely careful. She looked in the direction Darius had gone and then back out into the street, torn by conflicting concerns. She didn't want to leave her brother alone, but neither did she want the conversation going on outside to continue without her involvement. The server leaned over the counter to see what she was looking at.
"Oh, that's the Mayor's watch. They'll be able to help you."
Parthenia broke away from the group and stepped to the cafe. As the door slid aside, she peered in, quickly found Carina and said,
"Is Darius ready to leave? These people are going to take us wherever we want to go."
Carina urgently motioned for her sister to come closer. Appearing puzzled, Parthenia walked between the tables to reach her. "What's going on?" Carina fiercely whispered in her ear, acutely conscious of the server's gaze upon her and the distinct possibility the patrons were trying to listen in too. "Who have you been speaking to? What did you tell them?" Parthenia's mouth fell open. Then she said,
"I was trying to help. Those people came up to us and explained their guides for off-planet visitors. We told them what we needed and they said it wouldn't be a problem. Except you seem to think it is."
"Guides for off-planet visitors? Do they look like guides to you?" Parthenia looked back at the 5 members of the Mayor's Watch.
"You think they don't? What are guides supposed to look like?"
The attention their conversation was attracting made Carina even more uncomfortable. She wanted to tell her sister she needed to be way more discreet. They had to be as anonymous as possible, and she shouldn't have to remind her about it, but she knew it would only make things worse. At that moment, Darius skipped from the rear of the cafe and grabbed her hand.
"Well?"
Parthenia asked.
"Are we going with the guides or not?"
Damn it! She felt forced into a corner. If they didn't go with the Mayor's Watch, it would seem strange and suspicious, and she had no clue how she was going to buy starship fuel otherwise. Yet she had a strong feeling this new turn of events wasn't to their advantage, and the men and women waiting outside were not who they claimed to be. Chapter 17. The transportation the Mayor's Watch used was a wide vehicle that came up to Carina's shoulders. Its exterior appeared to be made from burnished steel, and the front and back of the vehicle narrowed down to snub-nosed points. It hung suspended a few centimeters above the road surface, and when one of the watch opened the passenger door, the large car wobbled. "Climb in," said the man. "Plenty of room inside." Watchful and worried, Carina peeked in before being the first to enter. Nothing seemed amiss. Seats covered in thick, soft, deep purple fabric lined the interior, arranged to face inwards. She chose one of the seats nearest the door and perched on it in a state of readiness, though in reality she wasn't sure what difference her position in the car would make. If the trouble she anticipated occurred, she would need to get everyone out, not just herself. When Darius was next to step in, she gestured for him to sit next to her. Parthenia stooped as she followed him, accompanied closely by Camille. Halliday and Justus took seats opposite, and Shao sat next to Darius. Only 3 of the Mayor's Watch joined them. The other 2 remained outside when the car door slid silently closed. The vehicle rose higher and sped off. Carina studied their new companions, sizing them up. They all wore figure-hugging, deep red suits comprising jackets that ended just above the hips, matching vests, and straight-legged pants. Slim boots of red leather rose high above their ankles, fastened by gold buttons on the outer sides. Their look was attractive and expensive, and not particularly military, which was somewhat reassuring, but not sufficient to make her relax her guard. One of the two men in the triad reached out a hand to her, smiling confidently. "I'm Ronnie." He'd correctly guessed she was the leader of the group. She shook his hand. "Pleased to meet you, Ronnie." She wasn't going to tell him her name if she could help it. She had a feeling he already knew it, and she regretted her lapse in security at the spaceport. She should have thought up a fake name for everyone. She'd been too nonchalant and careless. "This is Malta," Ronnie added, gesturing toward the other man. "And Vazan." His gaze turned to the female member of the Mayor's Watch, who also smiled, though Carina detected a certain frostiness. All three of them were physically fit, their muscles outlined in the fabric of their suits. Guides? More like guards. They didn't appear to be armed, at least. She still didn't volunteer her name. To avoid the embarrassment of the omission, and fearing one of her own party would feel obliged to tell the watch all their names, she said, "We don't have much time before we have to leave Magog, unfortunately. I need to arrange some business in the few hours we have." "I understand completely," said Ronnie. "Your sister here filled us in." He focused his grin on Parthenia. Sister? What else had Parthenia told them? Carina glared at her, but she was whispering with Camille and didn't notice. "You'd only like to speak to someone about purchasing some fuel?" Ronnie said. "It's a shame we won't get the opportunity to show you more of Japheth and Magog, but we're taking you to a dealer who will definitely be able to help you." "Is it usual to offer services to visitors like this?" Carina asked rather coldly. "I've never encountered this level of friendliness in all the planets I've visited. I can understand it might feel unfamiliar to you. Gerial Sector isn't the friendliest place in the galaxy, but on Magog, hospitality is an important part of our culture. I was surprised you weren't made aware of the Mayor's Watch at the spaceport. Frankly, it's a little embarrassing for us. I hope you'll allow us to make it up to you over the next few hours." She frowned. Sure. She didn't believe him for a minute. What he was saying was completely at odds with the reception they'd received from the immigration officer. Something had happened since they'd left the spaceport that had warranted them being watched. The vehicle had left the mall area and was speeding along another road lined with villas, similar to the one the spaceport transport had taken. How large was Japheth? She wished she'd done more research before picking it as the place to land. Beyond the villas, the ever-present clouds drifted. Above, the heavens were deepening to dark blue as night swiftly approached. She leaned her head against the window and peered upward, wondering which, if any, of the stars was the Bathsheba. For safety reasons, the vessel was far distant, not hanging in orbit like other trading craft. She already missed Bryce. She'd left him in charge, along with Jace.
"Are we nearly there?"
asked Darius, swinging his legs. Did he need to pee again? His bladder seemed to be the size of a pebble these days. "Just another couple of minutes," said Vazan, attempting a smile, though it resulted in another frosty grimace. Darius looked at her and edged closer to Carina, wrapping his arm around hers. Xiao, who had been looking out into the cloud cover, suddenly gasped. Carina turned to look in the same direction and saw open sky. The clouds had disappeared, and, for the first time since they had landed, the ground was visible far below. In the deepening twilight, she could just make out treetops descending a mountain slope before spreading to the horizon and an expanse of black water.
"Oh,"
said Parthenia.
"we left the road."
Carina stared downward. Empty air was all that stood between them and the planet's surface. "Don't be alarmed," said Ronnie. "We're only taking a shortcut." He winked and continued, "Special privileges of the Mayor's watch."
"Are the vehicles in Japheth all required to travel on roadways?" Xiao asked. "Yes," replied Vazan. "It's a safety measure, just in case the agrav cuts out, though that's never been known to happen. If it did suddenly die, the vehicle occupants would only experience a drop of a few centimeters to the road. If we were to lose agrav out here, on the other hand, something quite different would result." "No kidding," Carina murmured. It was hard to estimate, but she guessed they were about 1 click high. "You know," she said to the Mayor's watch officers, "I hate to be a party pooper, but I'm really not comfortable with my—" She had been about to say family and friends, but stopped herself. "With my companions and myself taking unnecessary risks. I'd prefer it if we could stick to the road system. I'm afraid to reach the place we're going, we have to skip outside Japheth City," said Ronnie. "It's unavoidable, but we'll be sure to take the safer, though longer, route on your return." Carina mentally cursed. Where the hell were the watch taking them? It was clearly somewhere difficult to leave. At least they had elixir with them, and if the worst came to the worst, they would be able to transport everyone out. "So you're taking us to a fuel dealer?" she pressed. "Yes," Ronnie replied, "but the person you're going to see deals in many products and services. Starship fuel is only one of them." "Cool," said Camille, his intense conversation with Parthenia lapsing for the first time since they'd set out. "What's it like living on Magog? Seems like a great place." Parthenia rolled her eyes. Carina wondered if the couple had been quietly fighting. "To be fair, none of us has ever lived anywhere else," Malta replied, casting a brief glance at his companions. "But speaking for myself, I love it. Life's easy here, the cost of living is low, and there's plenty to do. Cloud surfing, planet diving, and so on. I doubt there's anywhere better to live in the whole region." Camille elbowed Parthenia. She immediately elbowed him back so hard he winced. Finding their lovers' quarrel tedious, Carina pivoted in her seat to look in the direction they were heading. Night had fallen. They'd left the clouds behind entirely, and the inky blackness of space filled her vision. No street lights from Japheth or the landscape below lessened the brightness of the stars. She blinked. Some of the pinpricks of light representing 10,000 distant suns seemed to have formed into a regular pattern of vertical and horizontal lines. She blinked again and realized she was looking at artificial lights shining out from a structure hanging in mid-air. "Just another minute and we'll be there," said Ronnie. She pushed a hand into her pocket and touched the ember gems inside a cloth pouch. The small stones felt smooth and reassuring. Her other hand gripped the elixir canister strapped to her waist. The final moments of the journey were completed in silence. A square entrance to the structure opened, spilling light into the darkness. The vehicle flew inside and gently settled to the floor. They were in a bay holding several more agrav cars, though they were larger and grander than the watches. Ronnie was listening to a message from his earcom. The car doors opened on each side. "Our host is ready for you. He's looking forward to meeting you very much." Carina held Darius's hand and climbed out of the car. The hatch automatically closed, shutting out the vast night sky. She moved away from the vehicle to give the others room. Darius squeezed her hand and gave her a look of encouragement, as if he sensed her disquiet and was trying to make her feel better. A set of steps led up from the parking bay to a platform bordered by a railing. In the wall next to the platform stood a door, and at the exact moment her gaze fell upon it,
it opened. Raising his hands above his head as he moved, a tall man strode out and stood behind the railing.
"Welcome, my dear fellow mages. Welcome to Magog."
Chapter 18. Things were a lot quieter for Bryce aboard the Bathsheba without Carina, Parthenia and Darius around. He had moved back into the family suite in case Nala's nightmares returned, though she seemed to be coping okay without her little brother for company. During the active shift, she was busy immersing herself in the Mage documents, the ship's database, and any other source of knowledge she came across. The latter included Jace, who she questioned as closely about Mage history and lore as if she were a detective trying to solve a case. It was at dinner times that everyone appeared to particularly feel the absence of the 3 missing siblings. Now it was only Oriana, Fern, Nala and himself eating together. The flow of conversation was slower and intermittent. The twins would bicker and tease each other. Nala would relate whatever new information she had discovered that day, and he would tell the children if anything interesting had happened aboard the ship, a rare occurrence. Then the silences would come. They were not uncomfortable, however. It was just that they were all alone with their thoughts. Part of the problem was that there was little to do except wait for the excursion party to return with the fuel. It was after that the real adventure would begin. One time, while Bryce was thinking over the upcoming voyage and wondering what Earth might be like, Nala said to him, "Oh, I forgot to tell you. Jace asked if you would go to his cabin later."
"He did,"
Bryce replied, unsurprised the mage hadn't simply calmed him. The older man rarely used technology if he could avoid it, and as Bryce wasn't a mage, he hadn't been able to send to him.
"Thanks for the message. Will you guys be okay putting yourselves to bed?"
Of course," Fern exclaimed. "We're much too old to be put to bed. And besides, if we need a bedtime story, we can always ask Nala." The little girl grinned at the compliment. "I can tell you a story if you like. I learned a new one today about a mage in the olden times who helped other mages escape persecution."
"Did Jace tell you it?"
asked Bryce. "No, I found it in the documents. I told Jace about it." "Cool," Oriana said. "We'd like to hear it, wouldn't we, Fern?" "Sure." The twins were wearing outfits of the same brilliant green. Fern wore a jumpsuit that fastened at the front and a matching jacket that only reached his waist and elbows, and Oriana wore a dress that hung straight at her sides and reached the floor. Both twins wore head decorations in the shape of fans pinned to the backs of their heads. Oriana had recently had her hair cut short to match her brother's at the Bathsheba's automated hair salon. Their clothes were among the strangest they'd ever created, but Bryce had complimented them as he always did. Their activities alleviated the pervasive boredom, no doubt, and helped them develop their creativity. Though he'd never mentioned it to Carina, Bryce sometimes felt she and the rest of the mages focused too much on the aspect of themselves that set them apart from other humans. Considering how much their magehood impacted their lives, it was understandable, but he worried that it meant they would always distance themselves from regular people. That would be wrong and unwise. Normal people were not their enemies, no matter what Carina's grandmother had taught her, or what she had then taught her siblings. He felt sure the way to safety and acceptance for mages wasn't to live separately from non-mages, keeping their powers secret. It was to be open about what they could do, and to be friendly. Then, if some unscrupulous person tried to take advantage, they would have plenty of ordinary folks to protect them. Mages' clandestine ways had contributed to their troubles, in his opinion. He scraped the last forkful of beans from his plate. When he'd finished eating, he didn't get up right away. He watched Oriana, Fern and Nala as they continued with their dinners. He was glad Carina had chosen to not take them with her. The fact was, he loved them. He loved Carina, of course, but he loved her entire family too, and it would have hurt him to not see any of them ever again, or even for a while. At some point during the time he'd spent helping them to escape from monstrous Stefan Scherer and all the later escapades, the children had taken the same place in his heart as the blood siblings he'd been separated from on Ithia. He felt especially close to Nala, perhaps because, like him, she was a non-mage, and also perhaps because she had suffered the worst of all the family. The mage brothers and sisters had always had each other, but for a long while Nala had only had her psychopathic, sadistic brother as a companion. And then that time she'd seen the pilot killed and been trapped with the dead body, he suppressed a shudder. The 3 children had finished their dinners. They piled up their empty plates along with Bryce's, and Fern took them to the recycling chute. "I guess I'll go and see Jace," said Bryce, standing up. "Can you ask him if he'd like me and Oriana to make him some new clothes?" Fern asked. "Yeah, I can do that." He'd turned down the same offer himself only a couple of days ago and felt a little guilty about it, but the twins' creations were not quite his style. He didn't think Jace would be interested in sporting a bright orange gown emblazoned with stars either, or whatever it was they would dream up for him, but he would ask. "See you later, guys. Don't stay up too late." Jace lived by himself in a cabin near the Twilight Dome. When Bryce reached it, he knocked on the door, not knowing if the older man had even activated its comm. There was no answer. Then, just as Bryce was about to knock again, the entrance slid open. Jace said, "Sorry, I was meditating. I didn't mean to disturb you. I can come back later or tomorrow if—" "Please come in. It's no disturbance. I was expecting you." Bryce stepped into the cabin and immediately halted in surprise. One of the cabin walls displayed a forest scene. He could also hear birdsong and the sounds of other wild creatures and insects.
"Do you like it?"
asked Jace.
"It's fantastic. I didn't know it was possible to do that. Do all the cabins have that capability? I don't know. I only discovered it the other week myself. I would have thought they do. There's nothing special about this place."
Bryce was entranced by the scene, which wasn't a still image. The trees moved, and as he watched, a bird flew out of a tree.
"I can set all the walls to the same display,"
Jace said.
"but it's overwhelming, and, to be honest, it makes me homesick for Ostalon." "You used to be a forest ranger, right?"
Bryce looked around for a place to sit down. The room was tastefully decorated in a distinctive style. Jace had covered the tiled floor with a mat that appeared to be woven from natural materials, though he must have printed it. A bedspread decorated with vines and leaves lay over the bed, and a very low table sat next to a wall, with 2 similarly low chairs on each side. Jace lifted the table and put it down in the middle of the room. Bryce helped by transporting the chairs, while Jace collected a tray carrying a jug and 2 mugs from a corner. When Bryce sat down, he was only a few centimeters above the floor and was forced to cross his legs. As Jace also sat in the same position, he realized this was the idea.
"Can I interest you in a traditional mage drink?"
asked Jace, lifting the mug.
"As long as it isn't elixir."
Jace chuckled.
"Have you tried it? I snuck a drink one time when Carina wasn't looking. That stuff's pretty disgusting. You get used to it. This tastes a lot better."
"I'll have some," said Bryce.
"What is it?"
he asked, as Jace poured a pale green liquid into a mug.
"Char. It's supposed to be very good for you."
He slid the mug across the table to Bryce, who took a sip. The taste was bland, but not unpleasant.
"It's nice. How do you make it?" "Surprisingly, the ship's printers have it as a set option."
"They do?" Bryce paused, puzzled.
"I wonder how come they have a mage drink. I've been wondering the same myself."
Bryce took another sip.
"How are things going with Carina?"
asked Jace.
"Pretty good. She really liked the love band. Thanks for the tip."
Bryce considered a moment.
"Well, at first it made her cry, but she liked it in the end."
The mage's features softened with sadness.
"I didn't think of that. It must have conjured up some bad memories." "Yeah, pretty much. But it was okay once she got her feelings out." "I'm glad. She's gone through a lot. Is she doing all right generally?" "You know her. She's doing her usual thing of biting off whatever life throws at her, chewing it up and spitting it out. Is that why you asked me here?" "Yes, I worry about her. But she's so independent. She won't tolerate much interference. It'll just make her push me away. She's gotten better recently, but—" "I know what you mean. But like you said, I think she's calming down a little now." "I hope so."
Agitated banging came from the door. Jace gazed at Bryce in surprise before climbing to his feet and walking to it. When he activated the manual control, the open doorway revealed the old man, Calverley, scowling. "Your comm is broken," he said angrily. "I tried to hail you several times."
"I apologize. It isn't broken, only—"
Calverley pushed past him and strode into the room.
"Turned off,"
finished Jace, staring at the man's back. The former Shura Admiral turned to face both men. His health appeared to have improved. His withered cheeks were tinged pink, and his hooded eyes shone, though it was with ire. "Someone needs to do something about the foreign contingent aboard this ship."
"Foreign?"
asked Jace.
"Do you mean the—"
"The bearded men. You know who I mean. I don't know what they call themselves."
"The Lodokrillans,"
said Bryce.
"What do you mean we should do something?"
Jace's black brows had drawn together in a look between suspicion and dislike. "I mean," replied Calverley between his teeth, "they're figuring out a plan of some kind. I believe they mean to take over the ship."
"And what makes you think that?"
Jace's tone held a note of skepticism.
"I've spoken with several of them, including the man who seems their unofficial leader, Rebane. They're always civil and polite, friendly, I could say. I haven't detected—"
"What would you even know about it?" interjected Calverley scornfully. "You aren't military. Have you ever even fired a weapon? How would you know what signs to look for?" Jace seemed unsure what to say. He turned to Bryce for his opinion, but he didn't know how to respond to Calverley's allegation either.
"What exactly have you seen?"
he asked. "Conversations that are shut down the moment I appear. Men lurking where they've no business to be. They're running recon on the ship, figuring out where everyone is and at what times. I know it." Was it possible Calverley was right? The evidence for his suspicions seemed weak. Was the old man going senile? Perhaps as an effect of his prolonged time in deep sleep. He'd seen the state Calverley had been in when he'd come out of stasis. He'd barely been alive. And Carina had said he had had another collapse just after the medics discharged him. Bryce felt sorry for him, but he wasn't at all sure he believed him.
"I would advise against antagonizing the Lodokrillans with accusations," said Jace. "We've only just regained their trust after their walkout over Papu's incarceration."
Calverley huffed in disgust.
"But if they are planning something—"
Bryce's gut tightened. The Black Dogs and Lodokrillans' numbers were evenly matched. If Mezban soldiers attempted a takeover and they had the advantage of surprise, they might just succeed. On the other hand, if he put them in confinement based only on an old man's delusions, that would be certain to piss them off. It might even incite the mutiny Calverley suspected them of planning. He didn't know what to do. Chapter 19. Fazia Rebane was an imposing figure. Like all the Lotokrillon men, he was tall, broad and well-muscled, and he sat imperiously, his arms folded and knees spread wide. Calverley had taken a seat opposite him and was matching the man's frank stare with one of his own. The former Shura Admiral had printed himself a black dog uniform to wear. It had taken Bryce a moment to recognise the dark blue pants and sweater for what they were. The mercs generally slopped around in civilian clothes unless suited up for battle. It was one of the changes that had taken place since Cadwallader and Atoy's deaths. The line between the military and non-military contingents, the latter mostly made up by the mages, was becoming blurred. To Bryce, the change made sense. The black dogs were no longer being paid. They'd come along on the voyage to Earth by their own choice, and so they were not so much defenders of the mages, but fellow adventurers. The two groups were blending into one, and that promised to be a good thing. Except the same couldn't be said of the Lotokrillons. Bryce hadn't paid particular attention until Calverley voiced his suspicions, but when he thought about it, he realised the bearded men had been keeping themselves apart from the Bathsheba's other passengers. He really hadn't seen much of them at all. Perhaps he'd been remiss in not doing more to integrate the two sides, though Carina hadn't said anything about that before she left. Jace certainly appeared to think so. After Calverley had departed his cabin the previous evening, the mage had expressed his regret at what he thought was an oversight.
"I've been too preoccupied with Nala and mage matters," he had said. "I'm not sure I believe Calverley's accusations are reliable, but I knew the Lotokrillons were feeling isolated and disenfranchised and have done little to address the problem. I've made a mistake. I'll do my best to correct it."
So here they were. After listening to both Calverley's and Jace's concerns, Bryce had invited Rebane to meet up and discuss ship's business. He had also invited Jackson, the longest-serving black dog, to represent the mercs' interests. The man was resting his prosthetic arm on the table. Was he trying to match Rebane's subtly threatening attitude? It was hard to tell. Jackson's expression was mild and friendly, like Jace's, except Bryce doubted the mercs was genuine. Jace poured mugs of char and passed them out, introducing the drink in an amiable manner. Jackson lifted his mug and after a tentative sniff took a sip. He nodded and put the mug down. Neither Rebane nor Calverley touched theirs, continuing their eye-to-eye standoff. Bryce began to regret allowing Calverley to attend. He gave a small cough.
"I thought it would be a good idea to discuss what happens aboard ship while Carina's party is away buying fuel." "I'm here to discuss only one thing," said Rebane, his unblinking gaze not moving from Calverley's eyes. "And that's the release of Papu."
"I thought that had already been discussed," Bryce said.
"Not to my satisfaction."
Rebane thrust a finger at Calverley.
"He was released, why not Papu?" "I believe Carina made some accommodations for the prisoner," said Jace. "He's allowed regular visitors and whatever material he chooses for entertainment." "They are not enough."
Rebane finally switched his attention away from Calverley. His hardened features softened marginally as he spoke to the mage.
"We appreciate your efforts on Papu's behalf, but he isn't the type of person who can tolerate being confined alone for long periods. If his brother were still alive, it would be different. Lomang was Papu's guide in life. He looked up to his older brother and followed him in everything. Without him, and trapped in the brig, the man is going crazy. There's no telling what he might do."
Calverley snorted derisively. "That wouldn't be any great loss. He's a thug and a murderer from what I've heard." Rebane's head snapped around to return his attention to the old man.
"A thug and a murderer?"
he asked grimly.
Aren't we all thugs and murderers?
Jackson studied the fingernails of his natural hand. Jace cast his gaze upward for a beat and then said,
I think I can safely say I've never killed anyone. Not anyone human, anyway.
The voyage isn't over yet, Jackson muttered.
So you'll only be satisfied with Papu's release?
Asked Bryce.
You read my mind,
Rebane replied sarcastically. Calverley said, Absolutely not. Rebane shot to his feet, leaned menacingly over the table and slammed his hands down in front of the old man before saying,
And who the hell are you?
Calverley pushed his head forward until his face was a centimetre from Rebane's. More of a soldier than you'll ever be.
Whoa,
said Jace, also rising to his feet and flapping his hands in a gesture of placation.
Nothing's been decided yet. We're here to talk, so let's talk, okay? Please, he said to Rebane, sit down.
The Lotocrilan's features worked as if he was debating what to do, or perhaps struggling to overcome his anger. Calverley's cold gaze still fixed on him, he lowered himself into his seat.
Let's put aside the question of what happens with Papu for a moment,
Bryce said to Rebane.
I don't think your men's participation in our journey has ever been formally discussed. You joined us when we escaped the Regian planet at our invitation.
Exactly, Jackson interjected.
Since then, none of you has said you want to leave the ship, so we've assumed you're coming with us.
Rebane averted his gaze.
We cannot return to our home planet without Mezban.
Bryce guessed the Lotocrilan's loss of their commander must be shameful in their culture, whether or not her death was their fault.
Then, if you're staying with us, we need to find a way to get along. We don't want to spend the whole time at each other's throats.
Rebane grunted non-committally. Getting along, as you put it, said Calverley, is only one of several possible options.
I don't think we have any alternative, do we?
Jace asked.
We can't live in constant conflict and fear of our fellow passengers.
There are most definitely alternatives, Calverley countered, though perhaps they're better discussed in private. The Lotocrilan's eyes narrowed as he gazed at the old man.
This isn't private.
No, Calverley replied emphatically. Bryce wondered at his sudden apparently firm sense of allegiance to the Black Dogs. He was behaving as though he was a lifelong member, not Carina's former sworn enemy. Perhaps he felt he owed her a debt of gratitude for saving his life on Ostalon, or was he siding with the Mercs to help ensure his continuing survival? Whatever the answer was, Bryce wasn't sure whether Calverley was a help or a hindrance in their cause. He seemed to be only making tensions with the Lotocrilan's worse, but it was possible the show of resistance against Rebane's requests could deter them from rebelling.
What if we organise some social events, said Jace. A simple gathering in the Twilight Dome, for example. We can get to know each other a little better. Lotocrillans enjoy a drink, don't they, Vazia? And Mercs are the same, it goes without saying. Am I right?
He looked from Rebane to Jackson. The Black Dog smirked, but Rebane's features remained antagonistic. The mage seemed to deflate.
I'm not sure what else to suggest. I have a suggestion, said Rebane. Release Papu. That's all we ask. We don't want to cause problems. We want to live in harmony with our...
He paused as though trying to think of the right word, and his expression turned conciliatory.
Our benefactors. We know you could have easily left us with the Regians. I cannot say with any certainty that, if our positions had been reversed, we would have done the same, and so that makes us especially grateful. But we cannot tolerate a poor, simple man's imprisonment. If you were to give him his freedom, relations between we Lotocrillans and the Black Dogs would improve. We would truly look upon them as our friends. Calverley turned to Bryce. I strongly advise against this proposal. I think we should give it some consideration, said Jace, as a gesture of reconciliation and friendship. Bryce wasn't sure what to do. Papu's confinement was clearly a big sticking point. Rebane was constantly pushing for his release. Had the Lotokrillans factored him into a plan to mutiny? If Carina were here, he had no doubt she would not let Papu out. But her stance was always combative, and in the past that had sometimes worked against her. Calverley was of the same opinion, but he was another antagonistic personality. Jace obviously disagreed with the old man, yet he had no real military experience. He was concerned with smoothing the Lotokrillans' ruffled feathers. On the side for releasing Papu were Rebane and Jace. Calverley was against it. Jackson, Bryce said, what do you think? Should we let Papu out of the brig? Not in a fucking million years, the merc growled. 2 for, 2 against. He had the deciding vote. All gazes were upon him. He looked from Rebane to Jackson and at the 2 other men. He rubbed the top of his head, trying to figure out what to do for the best. Finally he said, "Okay, Papu goes free for now."
Chapter 20. It was the middle of the quiet shift when Fern started shouting out in pain. Bryce had been deeply asleep, dreaming of Ithia. He'd been a child again, in the mountains near his home, snow gliding with his younger brothers and sisters. Except in the dream, he'd fallen face first into a snowdrift, and when he'd managed to extricate himself, his siblings were nowhere to be seen. His parents had disappeared too. He had called out, shouting their names, but only his own voice had replied, echoing back at him from the dark trees. Fern's yells blended with his own shouts in his mind as he wakened, the external noise dragging him up from the depths of his subconscious. He opened his eyes in darkness, the threads of his dream still clinging to his thoughts. Disoriented, he lay still.
Where am I? What was that? Fern!
He threw back his covers and leapt out of bed.
Light! Door open!
The room burst into illumination. He ran for the door, reaching it before it fully opened and turning sideways to slip through the gap. Meanwhile, Oriana had also started hollering. "Fern, what's wrong? Someone help! Please help Fern!" As Bryce raced across the living area of the suite, Nala's door opened. The little girl stood in the doorway, clutching an item of clothing to her chest. Her long dark brown hair a messy halo. "What's?" she asked, but Bryce didn't hear the rest. He'd reached the twins' bedroom seconds after he awoke. Fern was sitting up in bed, holding his head, still yelling. Oriana leaned over him, her arm across his shoulders. When Bryce appeared, she looked up. Her eyes were shiny and her chin trembled. "Please help him, Bryce. I don't know what's wrong."
Yeah, of course. I'll come for a medic.
He sent out the request and then sat on the other side of Fern from Oriana. The boy was hunched over as if in great pain. Bryce had never seen anything like it. Was Fern suffering from a brain disease? Surely it would be impossible to catch a disease on the ship. Or had something happened to him on the Regian planet, and they were only seeing the effects now? Bryce also held the boy and waited tensely for the medic to arrive. Suddenly Fern's hands fell to his sides and he flopped backward onto his pillows. He was pale and sweat shone from his upper lip and forehead. He exhaled, letting out a moan of relief. "Oh, that was terrible. Is it over?" Oriana asked. "Are you feeling better? What was wrong with you?" Fern massaged his temples. "Yes, I think it's over. I think he finally shut up." "Huh?" asked Oriana. "What are you talking about?" Nala walked into the bedroom, still holding on to the piece of clothing.
Is Fern sick?
No, I'm not sick, he replied, though his tone remained strained. The external door chime sounded, and Bryce told it to open. A black dog medic ran in carrying a bag of equipment. He came straight into the bedroom, paused, and looked around before focusing on Fern. Is this the patient? Yes, Bryce replied. Something's wrong with his head. He was in a lot of pain. Nothing's wrong with my head, said Fern irritably. I'm fine now. The medic said. It won't hurt to take a look. He strode to the bed and deposited his bag on the cover. Have you hit your head recently? He opened the bag and pulled out a handheld scanner. No, Fern exclaimed. If everyone would just be quiet a minute and let me speak, I'll tell you what was wrong with me. Everyone waited. Darius was sending to me, or more like, he was screaming at me. Fern looked at Oriana. You know how powerful his casts can be. He was excited. He shook his head and pulled himself upright. I'd still like to take a look at you, the medic persisted. Brain injuries can be subtle, and they have wide-ranging effects that are harder to fix the longer they're left untreated. It'd be best to have a quick check-up, urged Bryce. You know Carina would want you to. After a sigh, Fern said, Go ahead, but there's nothing wrong with me. Bryce moved out of the medic's way as the man walked to the boy's side. He held the scanner to the side of his head and waited until the machine beeped. Checking the screen, he nodded. You'll be relieved to hear there is a brain in there. He chuckled at his own joke while Fern rolled his eyes. You're fine, the medic added. I know, Fern said. I just have an annoying younger brother. But reach out again if the pain returns. It doesn't hurt to be cautious, and these things, he waggled the scanner, aren't infallible. Oriana returned to her bed and pulled her covers over her knees, while the man put away the scanner and closed his bag. Fern stuck the heels of his hands in his eyes and rubbed before saying, Darius was telling me something really odd. I don't know whether to believe him. I'll get out of your way, said the medic. He left, and Nala said softly, Can I sleep with you, Oriana? Sure, Oriana replied, lifting a corner of her bedspread. The little girl had clearly been unnerved by her abrupt awakening, and Fern's yelling must have also been traumatic. What was Darius saying? Bryce asked. Are they all okay down on Magog? It was a bit jumbled, Fern replied. But basically he kept repeating, Mages, they're all mages, Fern. Everyone on Magog is a mage? Oriana asked in wonder. That's what it sounded like, but I don't think that could be true, could it? He must be confused. Yes, Oriana said. He is only 7. If Darius says it, it has to be true, said Nala petulantly. The emotion was unusual for her, and when Bryce looked, he saw the clothing she was holding on to was Darius's pyjama top. She must be missing her little brother more than he'd thought. It'll be cool if he's right, Fern said. A whole planet of mages? We wouldn't have to go to Earth. No need for years and years of deep sleep. We could live on Magog the rest of our lives. Oriana's eyes widened. I would love to live in a cloud city. We could start our own design business, Fern, selling clothes to mages. I bet they would buy our stuff. It's exactly what mages would like. Can you send back to him and ask him to explain? Bryce asked Fern. Or would his reply be too painful to receive? Fern grimaced at the suggestion. Even if his answer wasn't going to blow my head off, I can't send that far. None of us can, only Darius. I tried replying when he was talking to me, telling him to quieten down, but he couldn't hear me. It was like a one-way comm. I certainly hope he waits until he gets back before he tells me anything else he finds exciting. A whole planet of mages? Bryce mulled over the news. He guessed it could be possible. The mages had departed Earth in several ships. A group of them might have settled in Gerial sector and never been driven out or into hiding by the following waves of non-mage emigrants. The Lotokrillon man, Justus, hadn't mentioned anything about mages on Magog at the meeting, but they would be unlikely to tell outsiders about their powers. If that was so, Oriana was correct. The discovery threw a whole new light on things. Carina had wanted to go to Earth because she hoped to find a safe place for mages to live. Magog could be that place, which meant they didn't need to go any farther. They could abandon their voyage right here. There was only one way to be sure: calm Carina and ask her. But in order to do that, he needed to go to the bridge to use the ship's external comm. The Black Dog's techs hadn't managed to integrate it with the internal system. Bryce yawned. Fern had already snuggled down into his bed, and Oriana was cuddling Nala. The suite was silent. Even the barely perceptible hum of the Bathsheba's drive was absent as the ship hung in space without fuel. Mages on Magog. The question could wait until morning. The end. This has been Flight from Sanctuary, Star Mage Saga Book 6. The next book in the Star Mage Saga series is Fatal Star, Star Mage Saga Book 7. For more J.J. Green books, visit jjgreenauthor.com.